Good morning, welcome on this sunny Sunday morning. Well done for coming back. It's nice to see so many of you back again. So yesterday you had quite a long, immersive day into the impacts, but you did an amazing job in grilling our speakers that we had and really starting to get to grips with some of the impacts of the question that we're dealing with. Before, we've got a bit of admin to get through, and I've got a huge list of extra things to go through. One of the first ones is, does anyone own this coat? Does anyone want, I tell you what, you don't have to come and get it now, but if you want it, it's over here. Or else I'll take it home. So, just a quick reminder then. So this is the question that we had set. How do we reduce congestion, improve air quality, and provide better public transport in Greater Cambridge? Just wanted to remind us a bit about that question, a couple of things. I think we have to remember in our discussions that we're talking about Greater Cambridge, not just the city centre. You come from that Greater Cambridge area, and we need to think about that in our reflections. We also talked yesterday about growth quite a lot, and I think just remembering that, again, we said that will come up in discussions, but that the sort of scale of the problem that we're dealing with is the growth that is already sort of in the system and planned to be in the system in the short term. Okay, so we can't stop that happening. There's already the issue, and if you remember Lynn's slide with that green bar at the bottom, there was sort of quite that scale of change that we have to deal with now. The other thing to bear in mind, I'm giving you lots of kind of tips and clues here, is that, again, there will be recommendations and things that you think should happen that are national. You know, national government should do this. That's fine. But what we really want to come up with at the end of the 2 weekends are recommendations that GCP can also do something about. We can note those things, but we can't sort of have impact on those happening. So just sort of think about that. Centrally, what we want to ensure at the end of the 2 weekends is that we have good, solid recommendations that GCP can do something about. And I just wanted to very quickly, where's David? David Metz, there he is. Just really quickly, David, and I've got some other things to go through, just talk about, I think, a little bit about that scale of the challenge that we have.
Yes, okay, so these are the objectives, and we need to focus on the means of achieving these. So we need to think, what are the most important measures that could be undertaken that would get the outcomes we want? Now, it's worth thinking about what's been happening in London, because London, like Cambridge, has had a long period of economic growth and population growth. In fact, the population of London has been growing since about 1990. But car use in London has not increased in that time. And the reason is that car use has been limited by the capacity of the road network. So there was a debate in London in the 1960s and 1970s as to whether we should adapt London to the motor car. And a plan was made to build an elevated motorway box around central London to accommodate the expected growth of car ownership and car use. And one bit of that was built called Westway, which you may have come across, elevated motorway from central London going westward over really quite nice residential areas. And there was, of course, a strong reaction against that. It really was damaging to the urban environment. And the plans to build the motorway box are abandoned. So London has retained its historic street pattern, and indeed capacity for motor cars have been reduced by creating more space for bus lanes, for cycle lanes, and for pedestrians. So the use of cars in London has been constrained over 30 years now by road capacity. But in order to accommodate the travel needs of a growing population, there's been big investment in public transport. Now, London has had the great advantage of inheriting a rail system, a historic rail system, both underground and overground surface rail. And you can increase the capacity of rail systems by improved signalling, more trains, longer platforms, and so forth. And what rail does in urban areas is to give you fast and reliable travel compared with buses, cars on congested roads. So that's what has made the avoidance of car growth in London possible, the investment in high-quality public transport. So that's the big picture for London. And the question is, what is the big picture for Cambridge? What is it that Cambridge is going to be able to do to provide a fast and reliable alternative to the motor car on congested roads? So while there are many measures that you can think about, all of which may contribute to packages which we'll be discussing at the second weekend, I would encourage people to think about what are the most important things that can be done that will really make an impact.
Great. Thanks, David. I think what we're slightly doing there is we're teeing you up for the fact that the second weekend is going to start to deal with some much tougher choices to make. Just to recap again, why the Citizens' Assembly is happening, called by Greater Cambridge Partnership, partly funded by the government's Innovation in Democracy programme, and there we have again the question for the Assembly. And remembering that you here are that reflective group of citizens from Greater Cambridge coming up with those recommendations. There were some questions I know that came up yesterday about reporting and what's going to happen to the recommendations and what format the report is going to take. So essentially, and you will see a lot more of this in the second weekend, most of the report that we will produce will be around those recommendations, many of which are going to be produced through voting, through different voting applications that we will take next week. And then lots of the work that you've been doing at tables and that you will continue to do is part of the sort of the depth and the context behind what those final recommendations will look like. So we're not going to do any analysis. Lots of what we do is reporting on exactly what it is that you've come up with. And our aim is that we will quite quickly get a headline report on that, like within 24 hours or so, and then there will be the fuller report afterwards. And we can talk more about how that process works separately if people have questions on that. So today, what's happening today? So today we're going to be much more looking now at visions. So yesterday we looked about impacts and now we're looking forward. And we're going to hear and explore different visions of how things could be different, both from a Greater Cambridge perspective and also drawing on inspiration from other areas, from other parts of the world, other locations. As yesterday, it's a chance for you to have your questions answered on those and to start thinking about some of those issues. And developing, this afternoon, we're going to be developing the Assembly's view on what's important in a vision of the future. And then at the end of the day, we're going to start to think, and David touched on it there, so if that's the vision of where we want to be for Greater Cambridge, what are the measures that are going to take us there? And the second weekend is going to look in much more depth about those measures and some of the more difficult measures and options and choices and trade-offs that you might have to make. And as yesterday, hopefully you will also be having a good time. So that's what we're going to do today. This morning, after some introductions to your table, we will be hearing from a panel of people giving some Greater Cambridge perspectives, and then you will have the chance to direct some questions at them again, as we did yesterday. Lunch will be outside as per yesterday. In the afternoon, we will be hearing about establishing what GCP have got on the kind of cards at the moment, so that's clear that you understand what's kind of currently underway and planned, but also hearing from Professor Rachel Aldred later about case studies from wider than Cambridge, and inspiration from other areas that have tackled this issue. Some questions, and then the rest of the day is, or a big chunk of the rest of the day is you working about what your visions are. We'll then hear a little bit from David about transport, supply and demand before coming back and taking, I've said they're a vision vote, it's a sort of prioritization on what you think is important for that vision. And then we'll have some wrap up and give you an overview again of what's happening for weekend 2. So some things to remember. Remember your evidence packs that are on your tables that you might want to refer to. Remember to have a look at the travel stories wall that is outside. Yesterday, if you remember, we had the bike rack, and lots of people started to put some things up there about ideas that were slightly outside of what you might be talking about on your tables. We added an additional thing to the bike rack, which is a solutions bike basket. So again, what we heard yesterday was that lots of people were going, well, this is the answer, this is what we need to, this is how it could be solved. And so if you're thinking of those things, then pop them up on the solutions bike basket. Next weekend, we are going to start talking about some of the measures that can create that reduction in congestion, address air quality, and start to sort of improve public transport. So I don't want you to sort of sit on those, put them up there, because it's useful for us to see the sorts of things as well that you're coming up with. You don't have to put them up there, but that's the space for them in the bike basket. Okay, Elliot. Where's Elliot? So Elliot is our filmmaker. So he's making a program for the whole IIDP program. Some of you yesterday said that you were keen on maybe speaking with Elliot. He's got your names. So if you want to do some talking to camera, little vox pops, Elliot you can go and nobble Elliot in the break times or at lunchtime. You might also want to, so if you don't want to do that now, Elliot might also be talking to some people outside of the assembly. So if you fancy doing that as well, go and speak to Elliot. Remember, of course, that Boris is live streaming the presentations. So that's as it was yesterday. Expert leads. We've heard from David a bit today, and we've got Peter who's at the back. Remember, you have, and your facilitators have their blue content cards. So if you want to draw on some other expertise when we don't have the speakers here, you've got a question about something, wave your blue card. Observers, as per yesterday, on the back row, same rules apply. I don't think we've got any press, so that's fine. And then finally, your conversation guidelines. If you remember yesterday, we came up with a long list. Tim, do you think you can flick that door open? This one here. So, at your tables and when we're having conversations, step forward, step back. If you remember, if you're somebody who's maybe a little bit reticent, push yourself forward to have that conversation at your table. And likewise, if you're somebody who might tend to dominate in a conversation, maybe give people some more space to contribute as well. No question is a bad question. Ask it. Phones away and on silent. Respect each other's privacy. So yesterday, if you remember, we asked everybody about their consent for filming. But if you've got mobile phones, don't take pictures of people. Assume that it's that they don't want their photo taken unless you've expressly got that consent. Talk about the experiences of being in the assembly, but not about the outcomes now. If you remember what Tim was saying about we want to report the outcomes as a whole picture. But by all means, talk about how you've been experiencing the assembly so far. Respect everybody's opinion and background, keeping an open mind, keeping on topic, keeping it local and not political, no Brexit, if you remember. And actually, I think everybody was, I don't know what it was like over lunch, but I think everybody was quite good about that. Actively listening, making sure that we're not just sort of nodding, but our ears aren't open, but actively listening to what people are saying. Avoiding repetition, no interruptions, one person speaking at a time. Signal when you want to contribute on your table, you might want to use a hand signal for that. Try not to get into heated arguments, and your table facilitators should be helping with that. Speak to the table, so be inclusive of the people that are around your table, make sure that everybody's voice is heard. Don't rush, give people time. Some people are very quick at giving responses, other people need a bit of time to think about it. Think about your body language as well, that says volumes. And be open to challenge, start fresh. You might have come yesterday, come today with some preconceived ideas, but maybe you're going to hear other things that might change your mind. And be kind and helpful to each other. I think actually you seemed like a very kind and helpful group yesterday, so I hope Sunday brings the same. Okay. That's definitely enough talking from me. I'm going to hand over to your table facilitators to have some introductions on your table. Thank you.
Get everybody's attention. So we're going to kick off with the first panel of speakers for today. So as Suzannah said earlier, yesterday was a little bit of doom and gloom. It was about all the impacts of the problem, essentially. Today is going to be much more positive, much more enthusiastic, much more about kind of future visions for what might be possible. And to help us to think about that, we've got a fantastic panel lined up of people from the local area, from a range of different perspectives to help to give some of that sense of what might be possible in Greater Cambridge. So we'll be hearing from Anne Miller, who's from Carbon Neutral CAMS. We'll be hearing from Edward Leigh from Smarter Cambridge Transport. We'll be hearing from James Littlewood from Cambridge Past, Present and Future. We'll be hearing from Alex Plant from Anglian Water, John Grant from Fen9 Users Association, and Roxanne from CamCycle. So it's going to operate, I guess, a little bit similar to yesterday, but with a few tweaks. So this time, because we want to give as much time for your questions as possible, we're giving the speakers slightly less time today, so they're going to have 5 minutes to give really kind of rapid kind of presentations to kick off the discussion. But then there's going to be lots of time for you to be able to answer your questions. So as with yesterday, as you think of questions, as the speakers are speaking, jot them down on Post-its. We're going to give you about kind of 30 seconds to a minute between each speaker, just to reflect a little bit and kind of capture your thoughts. But we're going to go through all of the speakers all in one go, and then after all of the speakers have spoken, then there'll be a bit of time at your tables, as we had yesterday, to then select what do you think are, the top priority questions that you want to put to the panel to answer. Also remember your yellow and red cards. So if as a speaker is speaking, something doesn't make sense or they're speaking too fast, a yellow card signals just for them to slow down a bit. Red card signals that they've lost you and you want them to repeat the previous point. So remember to use those if you need to. And don't be afraid to be the person who does it, because if you're not understanding, there'll be somebody else who's not understanding as well. So do use those as needed. And we've got Isabel at the back who will be doing the timekeeping for the speakers as well. So we'll make sure that speakers are sticking to their 5 minutes. Can I just remind the speakers to keep the microphone nice and close to your mouth, just so everybody can hear. But without further ado, I will ask Anne Miller to come to talk from Carbon Neutral Cambridge.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Am I holding the mic right? Great, thank you. So we were asked to present, in summary, what are the most important factors to consider and why, and to share our ideas and views of the future in 5 minutes. So I've tried to be very brief, and I'm sharing one idea, and I think the others are also sharing one idea. So the most important factor, next. is clearly, we think, reducing the scale and impact of climate change. Otherwise, we are stuffed. So the graph I put up here is the last 800,000 years of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide levels is like the duvet that you've got. You put on too many duvets, it's okay for about 30 seconds, and then you start getting very, very hot. 800,000 years ago, climate change, CO2, climate change, temperatures going up and down, ice ages coming and going in sequence with the CO2. And if you could put the pointer up there, we are currently there. You can see what's been happening. This is absolutely unprecedented. We have to stop it. We really have to stop it. And what this means is that we need to halve our fossil fuel emissions well within a decade. Well within a decade. We need to start now. We need to tackle everything. So, next slide. Why? Well, just a few months ago in Cambridge, we had the UK's record temperature ever, 38.7 C in July. God, wasn't it hot? But that's just the start. That's just the start. It's really scary. On the other hand, we can also have better, healthier lives. And there's an image here that a group called Car Free Day in London produced, just a vision of what, I'm not quite sure where it is, somewhere looking towards St Paul's, would look like. It can be greener, it can be healthier. Who likes sitting in congestion? Who likes breathing polluted air? If we're all encouraged to cycle more, we can cycle more because there's more cycleways. We can eat healthier food. Life actually can be a lot better. So, that's why. Next slide. How? So, a few key things. This is just relating to the transport area. And I should incidentally say, our carbon emissions from transport have been going up in the Greater Cambridge area, not down. We are on the wrong track. We need to do something really dramatic. So, how? A question for you to consider. The number one is to switch from polluting vehicles to clean ones, whether that means a vehicle that has high MPG to low MPG, or from a polluting vehicle to an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles, of course, aren't the whole answer. They still do have carbon emissions. And of course, you know, bikes and feet are very low carbon. To share transport. I'm talking about shared transport, not necessarily public transport. Buses, trains are great. But if 4 guys drive into work in a shared car from Wisbech, that's 4 less cars than if they all did it together. So shared transport is good. There's some very interesting developments with apps and stuff like that. To travel less. If we have good rural broadband, there will be people who don't need to drive to work every day because they can work from home, at least some days of the week. Some of the solutions are non-obvious. And finally, the one that often gets forgotten, we actually need to own fewer cars. That doesn't necessarily mean not having access to a car when we need it, because it could be a car club. The embodied carbon in making a car is significant. It's nearly the same as a lifetime as an annual emissions. So an idea. Next slide. So we need to reclaim our streets from the car, and I'm talking about parking here. Sometimes restricting parking is a very fair and effective way to help reduce traffic. So let's reclaim our streets. Let's have parks and parklets and lots of greenery, like we saw in the Romsey area when the Mill Road Bridge was closed over the summer. Let's have wider pavements for pedestrians, pedestrian zones. Let's have more cycleways, better bike parking. Let's have space for these e-scooters and electric push scooters that is one seeing around, micromobility as it's called. Where we do need road space, of course we need road space. Let's focus it on the people who really need it. So, for example, it's deliveries, it's essential workers, it's carers getting to their workplaces, it's the disabled, it's car clubs, it's electric vehicle charging spaces, it's public transport. And let's raise money to pay for all this new public transport by charging for private car parks, and I'm meaning the university in particular here. Parking on public streets, illegal pavement parking, and all those dropped curbs that people are installing to be able to park on their gardens, which they have to pay a trivial amount for. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Anne. So we're just going to give you about 30 seconds now just to reflect on what Anne said. There will be more time after all the speakers have spoken to come up with questions as a table, but just get your initial reflections down on post-its for now. Okay, so I'm going to move us on to next hear from Edward Leigh from Smarter Cambridge Transport. So over to you, Edward.
Good morning. So I'm going to just talk about one idea out of many, many that we could talk about. And it's about how we cope with increasing the amount of buses coming into the city. Now, I want to just give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about, of the solution. That to get the number of people into the city by sustainable means we need to massively increase the number of people coming in by bus. And just as a rough estimate, that's 45,000 additional trips into the city by bus. To put that into perspective, Cambridge railway station takes 16,000 people. It brings 16,000 people into the city every day. The guided busway brings 5,500 people, mostly into the city. The cars at the moment bring 116,000 people into the city. At the moment, 120 buses an hour arrive in the city, or 120 buses arrive in the peak in the morning. We probably need to add another 100 to that. And the whole of Cambridgeshire brings 27,000 people, moves 27,000 people. So 45,000 people is a big number. Now, the current way that we route the buses is we bring them right into the middle of the city centre. We bring them to that Drummer Street area. And that concentrates lots of buses in a very small space, which requires a large, well-connected bus station. Like anyone who knows Preston will have seen there. It's one of the world famous. But Cambridge is not like Preston. This is what the city centre looks like. We have 27 bus stops scattered around the city centre. And they're about, you can end up having to walk 10 minutes between two stops. We cannot fit many more buses into that arrangement. We certainly can't fit another 100 in an hour. So I'm going to propose to you that instead what we need to do is we need to route the buses around the inner ring road. And that means that they come in on a radial road and then they circulate one loop around the inner ring road and then they exit on that same radial road. And that means you can interchange between any of those buses from anywhere in South Cambridgeshire to any other bus, to any other part of the city or any other part of South Cambridgeshire, with just one interchange at any stop on the inner ring road. And that means we need to have stops around the inner areas, and that probably needs to have about 3 bays for each one in order to bring in enough, or to cater for all of those buses. And this is what the routing would look like. So the buses come in on the radial, and they circulate around anti-clockwise. The doors are on the inside, the city side. Some buses would still loop round the city centre, so they go into Emmanuel Street, and that's probably going to be a sort of shuttle from Adam Brooks and the Trumpeton Park and Ride and the railway station. But all the other buses would circulate all the way around, and that means you can interchange between all of them. The benefits of this is it frees up space in the city centre. This is really crucial because we need more space for people to walk and cycle in that city centre, within the inner ring road. It increases the capacity for more buses. It puts more of the city centre within reach of South Cambridgeshire, and I'll show you there what difference this makes. So at the moment, that purple circle is roughly how far you can walk in 10 minutes from the city centre. If you have stops all around the inner ring road, then you cover much, much more of the city. You make much more of the city centre accessible by walking from a bus stop. And then it also enables people to get out of the city. And this is, I think, one of the under talked about things. We need to create more leisure opportunities for people in the city that are accessible by public transport, public and active transport. And this would do that. And it also brings more people to different parts of the city. So we're not all focused on getting our leisure and eating and restaurants and all the rest of it right in the city centre. The buses actually bring people to more of the city centre of the city, so we can have more of those amenities spread out around the city. This is what general traffic would do. It can still get everywhere, but it would use the inner ring road as a one-way loop. So the buses go in one direction, the other general traffic goes in the other direction. But you can still get everywhere. The Fen Causeway is one of the big problems in this because there is not there isn't an alternative route there. So that would have to stay two-way. But the rest of the city is still accessible. There will be slightly longer journey times, and that is a compromise that you'll need to debate about whether that's acceptable. This is the current bus network. It's like a spider's web. It's incredibly difficult to understand how to get anywhere around there. This is what it could look like. Much more like London Underground type thinking of connectivity, that you can get around much, much more easily if it's a network that looks like that. And so the questions I leave you with is this intuitively appealing? You know, does this get some of the benefits that you might want to see in a tram network? Is it acceptable to run all those buses down the backs? Because part of the inner ring road is the backs, the Queen's Road with those beautiful views of King's College. Is that acceptable? Is that an acceptable compromise? And if it's not, then is there another way that we could route the buses? Is it possible to fit those bus bays all the way around the inner ring road, at all the stops around the inner ring road? And is it acceptable for people to have slightly longer journey times by car if they have to? The final question is this worth exploring further? Thank you very much.
Thank you to Edward. So 30 seconds again, just to get any initial reflections down.
I need to hold my notes, so if someone can flip through if I just...
Okay, so I'm going to move us on again. So next up we have James Littlewood from Cambridge, Past, Present and Future.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, brilliant, thank you. So a quick question to start with. Hands up those of you who've been to Copenhagen in Denmark. Okay, one or two of you. Okay, right. So after years of planning for the car, unsurprisingly, by the 1960s, Copenhagen was full of cars. Copenhagen made a decision that it should be a city for people and not a city for machines. And over the past 40 years, they've reclaimed streets and squares for people. Since 2009, Copenhagen City Council has adopted a strategy saying, we will be the best city for people in the world. And in 2019, Denmark scored as the second happiest city in Europe. So this isn't exactly a before and after, it's a different street, but it does show you modern Copenhagen with 1960s Copenhagen. And there's more people on the right-hand side using that street than there is on the left-hand side of the street. So that maybe gives you an idea of what can be achieved. One of the people behind these changes is the urban designer Jan Gehl. And I found this quote from him from earlier this year. He said, if I could give one piece of good advice, it would be based on what we know from Copenhagen. For many years, going back to the 1950s, whenever there was a city planning problem, the traffic engineers were running to the mayor and saying, look, we need 6 more lanes here, and 3 more lanes here, and 2,000 parking spaces. They had the statistics and the arguments ready. On the other hand, there was not a single city in the world that had a department for people and public life. So I've been asked to consider the question as to what I think the future is for congestion, air quality, public transport in Greater Cambridge. And my answer is simple. I think we need to have a vision for Cambridge as a city for people. When planning our city, we should be asking ourselves, would cities like Copenhagen do this? So Cambridge Past, Present and Future's vision is about protecting the things that make Cambridge special so that future generations can enjoy them. So this includes the landscapes in and around Cambridge, which provide the city with its setting, its green lungs, its places for nature and people. We're about protecting historic buildings and the charismatic streets that make Cambridge such an attractive place to live, work, visit and play. These are things that help to sell Cambridge to investors, to skilled workers, to students and tourists, which help in turn to support our economy. In the quest for economic growth, Cambridge needs to be careful that it does not kill the proverbial goose that lays the golden egg. I've included these two images to show that we're quite capable of doing that. On the left is Stonehenge. Any of you who've ever been there know there's a major A road that runs past it. They're now putting a tunnel under that in recognition of the mistake that they made. On the right-hand side is Grantchester Meadows, which many of you will know is a popular recreation spot in the south of Cambridge. You may not know in the 1930s there was a plan to build a ring road through it, which we helped to stop. Now, if they'd built that ring road, probably congestion in Cambridge would be less than it is, but certainly Cambridge would be much less of a place as a result. So we need to find ways of tackling congestion that don't result in damage to the city's countryside, nature and heritage. And this is a challenge for a compact medieval city like Cambridge. And it's likely that big engineering projects will be damaging as well as expensive to deliver and run. So this is a slide which shows you the amount of road space taken by different types of transport. So there's the same number of people travelling in each of these images. So on the left you have a bus, in the middle you have cycled, and on the right you have cars. So can we be more like Copenhagen, and can we make better use of the road space that we have? So I think that we can, but that means like Copenhagen, we need to start designing and planning cars out of the city and reallocating space for people, cycling, walking and public transport. We also need to rethink about how we spend transport budgets, and we need to think about ways of funding these changes that might be required. So Cambridge has actually already made a start. So this is an image of Bridge Street in Cambridge, which shows that it can be done and what it looks like. So those of you who don't know, this street doesn't have any access to private cars. So it's not too dissimilar for what Copenhagen looks like. So I think we need more streets that look like this. So in summary, I think that we need to, A, learn from Copenhagen. We need to have a vision that puts people first. We need to avoid damaging our green spaces and historic buildings. We need to discourage cars and make better use of road space. Thank you.
Thank you to James. So same again, 30 seconds just for any initial reflections. Okay, so I'm going to move us on again. So next up we have Alex Plant from Anglian Water.
Good morning, everyone. Interesting that apparently yesterday was all about doom and gloom, so I see it as my job to try and bring lightness and joy to you this morning. It says on the slide I work for Anglian Water. Indeed I do, so I spend a lot of time worrying about how we can make the kind of driest part of the region, which is also one of the fastest growing parts of the country, how we deal with all that, how we make that work, and that's a lot about actually changing behaviours and how we think about water differently. But my background, I've worked in local government in Cambridgeshire. I've also worked in regional government, and I worked for the Treasury back in my youth. So I've thought about these sorts of questions quite a lot. And my comments this morning are not an Anglian Water point of view, but rather my own reflections as someone who spent some time thinking about these issues, and also as someone who lives in Cambridge. So my starting point really is to think about something that essentially was touched on, and particularly by James in his comments just now, about the quality of life that we generate in this place. And when I talk about this place, I mean the wider geography, not just the city of Cambridge itself. And when you think about that quality of life question, it immediately takes you into the issues around how is it that we make, I mean, I suppose my big idea is how do we make public transport, and indeed shared transport, walking and cycling, the most attractive option ahead of the private car? I think that's what we should be trying to address here. And when I think about the questions that make that difficult for us in this place, I suppose the historic core of the city of Cambridge is one of the issues, because clearly that is a massive benefit for Cambridge, but it also restricts what you can do with it in terms of transport in normal senses. I also think the scale of housing and economic growth in the area, which again is something to be positive about because it provides a huge amount of prosperity, not just for residents here and around, but actually of international and national importance as well. But also how we get to a position whereby you have much more predictable travel times. Because for those of you who move around this place, you will know that that predictability is a rare thing. I also then thought a little bit about some of the problems that stop us reaching the solutions we might wish to have. One of the biggest constraints we have is that the level of funding that is controlled locally in the UK is far less than almost any other part of the Western world. We are massively centralised, and the inability for local decision makers to access funding that flows from some of that growth that I've talked about makes it more difficult to reach for the solutions that we perhaps could choose. We need something that actually restricts the demand for car use, and we need something that actually increases the supply of public transport and other more sustainable forms of transport. And none of those things are particularly in our grasp at the moment. So what might be a solution? So I think my solution is that we need to do one transformative thing in terms of a new public transport solution, and I think I would put my money on the metro system that's being discussed, which allows us to go underground and deals with that historic core issue, and I think we fund it through the introduction of a congestion charge. Congestion charge would both deliver that restriction of demand for car use, but all of the money raised would be ring-fenced for enhancing public transport solutions, including for the metro. Some of the numbers that have been done suggest that a congestion charge would give you enough revenues to support the significant cost of around 2 billion for the metro scheme, a basic metro scheme that would allow us to do that historic core underground, and then it would be a kind of at level with the existing roads once you're out of the historic core. The nature of congestion charging you can use means you could actually also do things like use it to support and incentivize people using more electric vehicles, support the infrastructure for electric vehicles as well, address the congestion issue, enhance the quality of life, and provide something that's a really quite kind of statement about the kind of place that we are. So if you arrive and you've got a really, really sexy, attractive, reliable metro system for a smaller city, that says something about the kind of place that you're coming to. You'll all be familiar with the London congestion charge. I think that's actually a less good example. The one I would point us to for something that could work and is better perhaps fitted for Cambridge is what they've done in Stockholm. So we've heard about Copenhagen, which I agree is a fantastic place. Stockholm has also successfully used congestion charging to massively reduce the level of car travel within the city and use the revenues to improve transport solutions around Stockholm. So those are my ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex. 30 seconds again. Okay, moving on to our next speaker now. So next up we have John Grant from the Fen Line Users Association. Over to you, John.
Yeah, that's me. I'm chairing Fen Line Users, which is the user group for people. Sorry? Thought I was. Is that better? Okay.
Just nice and close to your mouth, John.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, this is the railway from King's Lynn down to Cambridge. Yeah, the rest of my life I'm doing things in digital communications, so I've taken a rather systems engineering approach to this question, and I have answered it fairly literally, I think. Also, you probably need to know that I live in Waterbeach. So looking at congestion and air quality, as I've said there, I think within densely populated areas, you kind of have to have some kind of mass transit because there isn't enough space to have any other kind of transport. Whereas out in the rural areas, so like down Waterbeach Fen, where there are only a very few houses, you clearly can't be running a bus every 10 minutes because it's going to be empty all the time. Looking at mass transit, like Alex, I'm sure that tunnelling under Cambridge is an answer. I've heard that it's quite good soil to tunnel through. And looking specifically at air quality, particulates, I believe, are about equal parts diesel smoke, dust from brakes, and dust from tyres. If you've got electric traction, that gets rid of the diesel smoke. And if you've got regenerative braking, that also gets rid of the brake dust, if brakes are only used in emergency. But you still want to get rid of that third part. And so for your mass transit, I think steel on steel is rather better than the rubber tyres that some people have suggested. Also, having said that our line is from King's Lynn down to Cambridge, it's probably not the most efficient way to get people from Waterbeach to the Science Park. Looking at heavy rail for longer distances, which certainly is bringing people in from Downham Market and Watlington and King's Lynn down to work in Cambridge, because for a lot of people that's the nearest they can afford a house, and reopening from Wisbech as well. But yeah, for the shorter distances, light rail certainly. But having said that you need some kind of individual transport for the people out in the rural areas, obviously there's then got to be a good connection between that and the mass transit, as I call it. So you're needing to have, put it this way, once someone's got in their car, you still want them to be taking public transport into the city here. So how will we improve public transport? Better use of digital media. This is something that I want to do in Fenline Users. We're currently waiting for to see if we've got funding for that from the rail industry. And as I said, create a community of transport users, because we spend so much time now just staring at screens instead of actually interacting with humans. And yet, in a train, you've got all these people who are actually in a room together for half an hour or whatever. If you can be using these media to actually help them to interact it rather better as humans, I think that will be better. We need to make it as convenient as owning a car. I live quite near to the station. It actually takes me as long to get to the station as it takes me to get the car out. For a lot of people that isn't so. And it's quite quick for me to buy a ticket, but certainly making it that we can, that you can just, in the same way that you go to your car, you click the button and it opens. You go to the station, you click your button and it opens. But of course, a lot of people who own a car, they keep a lot of stuff in it. Certainly my daughter's car is full of all kinds of things that she kind of feels she needs to have with her. And I think maybe we need to think a little bit about how people can carry their stuff with them, if you like. And finally, inclusivity. This is, again, one of my hobby horses, CS0. It's not just step-free access. There are people who don't like being in crowds, and can we please try and make it easier for them?
Thank you very much, Sir John. So 30 seconds again. Okay, so our final speaker of this panel will be Roxanne de Beaux, who is from CamCycle. Over to you, Roxanne.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Roxanne de Beaux. I work for Cambridge Cycling Campaign. We're a charity, a membership charity with 1,400 members, and for 25 years we've been working for more, better and safer cycling for all ages and abilities in and around Cambridge. Cambridge is the cycling capital of the UK, with over 50% of people cycling at least once a week. We have high rates of cycling that extend out into the villages, and my slides are going. Right, I want to talk to you about a vision for a cycling city. For many, cycling in Cambridge is still much too dangerous, and we hear that they're too scared to cycle because of the road environment. The GCP states they will work together to grow and share prosperity and improve quality of life for people of Greater Cambridge. That's not it. But imagine if children could cycle to school, what would the traffic be like? Imagine if people could cycle to work, what the traffic might be like. We really have an opportunity here to reduce congestion for everybody. Cycling benefits everyone, even if they don't ride a bike. There is a misconception that cycling is for the fit and the lycra clad. There's no lycra here today. But if you observe people in Cambridge, you'll realise that that just isn't true. Cycling is actually one of the most accessible and affordable forms of transport for the young, the old, and the mobility impaired. But to get these people cycling, we need the right kind of infrastructure. Cycling is also an excellent companion for public transport. It makes train stations and travel hubs more accessible and viable. Cycling will reduce congestion, which will allow buses to flow more freely. So I think we've heard a lot of visions here that cycling would support. Not only that, but cycling will keep us physically and mentally healthy. Fewer cars means cleaner air. Cycling-friendly streets are places to stop and linger. You can hear each other speak. You can breathe the air. And it turns out that you'll spend more money in local shops as well. And we've seen some great visions from Copenhagen and some ideas for London in the previous presentations. And I tell you that it's cycling that will get us there. With less car parking available for the growing organisations in Cambridge, more staff are being encouraged to cycle. Until recently, we've seen car traffic remain fairly steady despite the growth we've had in Cambridge. And that's cycling, I think, that is absorbing that growth. We also see things like last-mile cycle logistics that are absorbing the increasing impact of deliveries from all our online shopping. And it turns out that's faster and cheaper. So increasing inclusive cycling for transport will require prioritisation and investment. Cycling cannot be an optional add-on to our roads for cars schemes. We need to stop compromising cycling when difficult decisions need to be made. It needs to be part of our overall strategy and planned at the absolute top level. We need to be thinking about a cycling city. So what is it we need? Well, cycling infrastructure needs to be safe and separated from cars and from people walking. We must build a network with primary routes that are direct, attractive, and efficient. We should be talking about maintaining flow, not encouraging speed. Think about the greenways projects. Secondary routes need to provide those connecting sections that get you to your house. And these can actually be created by reducing traffic on local streets. Think about things like strategic bollards that let people cycle and walk, but don't let the cars through. But a cycle route is only as good as its weakest link. If you've got one spot that's really scary, you're not going to do the rest of it. And that's junctions that we need to think about. We need to be bold, and we need to make our junctions consistently safer with priority over side roads, sensible signals, and safe and visible geometry. We should be looking to the Netherlands for this, and their examples such as Dutch roundabouts, which are safer for people walking, cycling, and driving. More people cycling means fewer people driving. Fewer people driving actually means more people can cycle. But if we free up capacity on our road network, we need to be aware that that might just get filled back up again by more people driving. And that's where demand management will be really important. And we've heard some suggestions for things like congestion charging, and that's what we need to be looking at. So we have this amazing opportunity now, and we need to make the most of this with the Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership funding. Building a cycling city is probably the most effective transport option the GCP could pursue to realise their goal of shared prosperity and improved quality for life. And this is actually a GCP scheme that was just opened on Green End Road. Not everybody needs to cycle, and I'm not asking you to, but for everyone that does cycle, everyone else will benefit. So I say, let's look to the Netherlands as our benchmark, but let's build on the cycling success we already have. One final point is that the future doesn't have to be about new technology. Maybe the answer, cycling, has been with us in Cambridge all along.
Thank you very much, Roxanne. So 6 fantastically inspirational talks there. So a little bit of time now for you on your tables to think of your top priority questions that you want to put back to the panel. I'll ask you to come up with 3 kind of priority questions on your table and try to address those to a specific speaker, because we'll not be able to go through every question, every speaker with every question. So try to address your questions to a specific speaker, 3 priority questions. Thank you. 15 minutes. So we're going to come around table by table again. So you've got your top 3 questions, hopefully. When you're selecting which question to ask, obviously try to avoid any repetition. So if another table has asked you that question or a very similar question already, then kind of discount it. And also please try to, I guess we don't want all of the questions just to be addressed to one of the speakers. So try to pick a question maybe for somebody who hasn't just spoken or answered a question. I'm going to come to Penny's table first. Who's asking the question?
So I tried to step back, but my table said that I should step forward. So I'm going to be asking the question. And our first question is one that we did actually call the speaker over and get it answered at our table, but we thought it might be interesting for the rest of the room to hear the answer. So our question is, specifically to Edward, what are your ideas for the greater Cambridge area, not just you gave us ideas about that focused on the city itself, but what about the greater Cambridge area? If you could expand on that, that would be great.
Yes, definitely. So what I wasn't able to talk about is how those bus services outside the city look like. And we need a mix. So I said we'd probably need an additional 100 buses coming in. Some of those would be increasing the frequency of currently infrequent services, extending the hours of services, but also serving new routes. So, particularly to the east of the city, we have very, very poor coverage of buses. Now, in order to get buses as an attractive alternative to cars, they've got to be quick. And that means you've got to run them on direct routes, much like you do with a railway line, into the city with quick connections to other services. So what we need is what we've called travel hubs, which are like mini bus stations along those routes. And each one of those little hubs needs to have excellent connectivity into the local area. So that may be in the middle of a village, so you need good walking and cycling connection there. It may be in the middle of a group of villages, in which case you'd need to have feeder bus services or shared transport services that get people into those hubs, onto the buses, then quickly into the city. If they need to change to get to another part of the city, then there's that really easy, intuitive change on the inner ring road, and then that gets you to your destination. So that's the picture of how the whole thing's doing. More coverage outside the city, more direct routes with these travel hubs along those routes to get people in to connect with those bus services. Does that answer the question?
Happy? Yep. Okay, so let's move on to table 7 next.
Are we allowed to ask Edward another question? Sorry. Which is that we really liked your ring road idea on our table, but given that yesterday we heard a lot about the emissions to do with buses, is there any way of combining that with another mode of transport like a tram system? So having a tram going around the ring road instead?
Possibly, but actually buses, so Euro 6 buses, a Euro 6 bus is less polluting than most people's diesel cars. You know, it's not per passenger, that's per vehicle. So actually Euro 6 buses, if we could get all of the buses that come into the city to be Euro 6, that would be a huge improvement to air quality. We're also taking out a stream of traffic, and we're taking traffic out of the city centre. So we're reducing the concentration of pollution around the Drummer Street area by pushing the buses out, and we're taking some of the traffic out of the city centre, so we're reducing the contribution there. But certainly within 5 years or so, all new buses will be electric, fully electric. So, and that means zero pollution at from the vehicle itself. So that's really the future, is that we will have a fully electric transport system in the future. We've just got to get a few steps there. And actually what I wasn't able to show you and is in the slide pack that you can access are some stats about buses and talking a little bit more about how, what are the pollution impacts. But we're moving in a direction of having everything electric anyway, and that will solve that problem.
Okay, I'm going to come to table 4 now. A question not for Edward this time, please.
So I think the question's for James. James, were you the person who said people first?
Yes.
Okay, so again we're picking up on the rural issue, and we're picking up on thinking about Greater Cambridge, and there was a particular thing around actually in rural areas some places don't even have footpaths. So in terms of actually sort of in challenge to the bus scenario for rural areas, actually people first, cycling and walking, if that small road is taken with a bus and no footpaths, how do you bring that element in?
Well, I think that touches on the point about the people first, is that we've been prioritising road vehicles, machines over people. And if you start thinking about, okay, let's make decisions about people, well, it's no sense to not have a pavement or not have a cycle path. And so all of a sudden you're spending your money, a la Copenhagen, on things that have improved the lives of people rather than things that improve the lives of machines, mainly cars. So if you start that thought process in every decision you make, whether that's in a village or in the city, people first, then you start to make different decisions. And that doesn't change things overnight. Copenhagen didn't change overnight, it took them 40 years. So, there's a question about how quickly can we do this. I know there's a mad rush for growth and a desire to solve things quickly, but the experience of other cities and other places in Holland is another example of that. They didn't do that overnight. Again, that took them 40 years, but they kept making that consistent decisions based around people rather than cars.
Great, we're going to come to table 6 next, and a question for, ideally one of the other panellists, if you can.
If I can ask Roxanne a question, again, this is tying in with the rural theme, which seems to be quite important today. So how can we integrate rural communities without too much penalisation? So how can we, into your scheme of encouraging people to cycle, how can we spread that out into Greater Cambridge?
Yeah, and in 5 minutes, it's so hard to get that all across, and I think cycling can play such a key role. We've talked about travel hubs and getting people in those rural locations to be able to cycle to the travel hubs, for example, is really key. And you can actually have bikes at both ends. So even if you lived in the countryside and you went to your travel hub, you could keep your bike there, take your bus or your train into the city and have another bike there, or use a shared bike, for example. So we really need to be thinking about that cycling infrastructure out into the region. But also, it's surprising how far people might even be able to cycle into Cambridge if that's what they had to do. E-bikes are an amazing innovation here, where you can have a really pleasant, comfortable speedy journey without having to exert too much effort. So we need to look at that. And I think it's also important to realise that we've got a lot of people in Cambridge going out into various work sites as well. And I think we always think about people going in, but actually most of my friends are people that are going out, and they can't use travel hubs in the same way. So that cycling infrastructure needs to go in and out and around and connect the villages. Is that, yeah.
Okay, table 5 next, please.
Great, thank you. We've got a question for Alex. I'm going to be slightly cheeky. I'm going to sneak 2 questions into one. The question is about the metro idea. So where would the metro extend to? Where's your vision about where the metro would start and where it would finish? So, how far beyond the city, I guess, is the issue there. And the sort of related question is about Alex, was it your idea about the congestion charge? So when would that start applying in your, would we have to start charging the congestion charge first? And then the solution would follow on long behind? What's the sort of timings there?
Okay, thanks. So the first, I suppose one thing just quickly about the congestion charge generally is that it is essentially trying to answer the question of getting locally controlled funding that you don't need to go to government to say, please can we do something, please can we have money from you. It is our money, if you like, that can then be used to borrow against. So you can borrow against future revenue that you expect to get from the charge, which would allow you to improve cycling, improve walking, improve buses, and fund the metro. So that's kind of what it's for, if you like. And the question about when, well, that's always going to be the tricky one, because in my view, you need to sort of take the bold step of saying, yes, we accept the need for this. This is the sort of the bitter pill. And that not all of the benefits from it will be immediately upon you, because it takes a long time to build something like a metro system. Even a simple north, south, east, west initial spine of a system would take a while to put in place. So there's a period of time when people are contributing through congestion charging before they get the benefit of the new infrastructure that's there. So I think you need to start it early, borrow against it, and then try to move forward the improvements in public transport, walking and cycling that it would deliver. And that's the trade-off, and that's the question I suspect that you might think a bit about more next weekend when you come on to those questions. On the where, I mean, there are sort of proposals that are out there. I don't know whether that's all in the evidence pack stuff you've got as to where it would go. There are 2 elements of where, I suppose, on the metro. One is, where would it need to go underground? And in my view, it only needs to go underground really in the historic centre of town, where the benefits of going underground are worth the very significant additional cost that is attached to the tunnelling element. I think John made the comment about the tunnelling. The soil here is really good for tunnelling, and yes, it is. And some of the earlier conversations around this with Professor Mayer at the University of Cambridge, who did the Jubilee line extension, he looked at the soil and said this is very, very tunnelable, so that's all good. But you'd keep it to the minimum. It would be the historic core, and outside of the city centre, the metro routes would then be at surface, because you don't need to go underground there. How far out would they go? Well, to be determined. But my view is you take the metro nodes quite a long way out, such that they became a place where if you were accessing the metro, the external metro station, then you're not putting pressure on the more congested road systems within. So, I mean, you would go out as far to the south, say, as somewhere like Duxford, and have an intervening point there where the metro would extend to, and similar sort of distances out north, east and west initially. Then the question about where the congestion charge would itself kind of hit. I mean, again, if you've got, I haven't got a map, but if you've got a map of the sort of city area, there's a sort of natural bounding by the major roads. So A14 to the north, you've got the M11 to the west, and so forth. Logically, you've got a kind of a zone in which you could potentially decide that's where you would actually charge. The benefit of having the kind of systems you can now have with charging through automatic number plate recognition and so forth is you can be quite reasonably fine-tuned about how you deliver that charge. How you look at peak time, so you try and charge more at the peak time than you would elsewhere. You can also do things, as I think I mentioned, around incentivizing a shift towards electric vehicles by being a discounted charge for someone who is using an electric vehicle rather than a petrol vehicle.
Okay, so that multi-part question slipped through the net, but that's the last one. And I'll see you later, Clive. But we'll come to table 3 next.
Yeah, so we have a question for Anne. So you talked a lot about people cycling. How does cycling work for people who are unable to cycle? So how does people moving to cycling make things better for everyone, for people who are unable to cycle as well?
I think there's maybe also one for Roxanne, but I mean the key thing about cycling is that if people are not sitting in a large vehicle that's X square meters and they're on a bicycle instead, they're taking they're decluttering the road, and so that helps reduce things for everybody else. They're not polluting the atmosphere, increasing climate change. They're not contributing to air quality problems, so that helps everybody else. And as others have said, the developments that are happening with e-bikes are actually quite stunning. And so you really have to be quite disabled to be unable to ride an e-bike tricycle. And there's a question there from somebody.
Sorry, can we just...
Yeah. So the question there was what happens if you've got a visual impairment or are blind? And of course that's a really excellent point. Of course, not everybody can cycle, but the points I was making before about decluttering the roads, reducing pollution, still benefit people. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move on to table 2 next, please.
Right, thank you. I don't know if this counts as a multi-part question.
It better not.
Well, because I thought it's not redirected at one speaker, and I thought, but I'll do a list, and then I did a list, and in one way or another, I had everybody's name on it. But it was a sense of time scales in terms of some of these big measures that were discussed. So how long would it take to implement packages of measures like the lollipop bus routing, bearing in mind also you've got the non-polluting buses, or build the metro? How long would that take, even with your tunnelable soil, or a system in the Greater Cambridge area of segregated cycle lanes? What sort of timescales are people thinking of?
Okay, so I'm not going to get you to answer that question just yet, but when it comes to answering the next question that gets put to you, can you talk about timescales as well, just so we can deal with this those as quickly as possible? So we'll come to table 1 next for your question.
And I'm afraid I failed. I forgot to check if my group would like to ask the question. You sure? Okay, well. So we've got a question for James. Is there, from the plans you proposed, is there a risk of business being driven out?
No.
There you go. That's your answer table.
Most of the research that's been carried out around pedestrianisation, etc., shows that people spend more money. So, I mean, obviously there's an issue about how people are going to get in to support, the high street is declining even in Cambridge, but all the evidence of pedestrianisation schemes around the rest of Europe is that you pedestrianise it, you make it a more attractive environment, people want to go there, they spend more money. There's been lots of research done to show that that's the case.
And do you want to say anything about timescales?
Timescales, yeah, quite interesting. Obviously, in terms of how fast you can do things, this is the order in which they go. Walking, very quick. Cycling, pretty quick. Buses, not too bad. Metro, very slow. So the bigger the scheme, the bigger the engineering, the longer it takes to do it. So for a metro, you could be looking at 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
Great. So we've been around all the tables now, and we've heard from all of the speakers apart from John, I think. So does anybody have a question for John? Okay, so I'll come to your question.
John, what would you propose in terms of the transport between Waterbeach and the Science Park? So how would that look?
Ooh. I'm trying not to be political here. You know that Urban and Civic are doing the first development, which is off the end of the site towards the A10 and away from the railway. They're proposing to go down the Roman road that goes behind Land Beach and comes out between the Science Park and CRC. And that certainly seems to me to be a sensible route to go. What they're going to put on that is, I think, not yet decided.
Okay, I'm going to come back to table 8 for another question.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to something else about the congestion charge, actually, for Alex. So we had a concern about the kind of equality implications of that. How do you design it in such a way that it isn't an extra burden to people who are already find it hard to pay for things, and too easy for people who find it easy to pay for things to just kind of absorb? And just a quick clarification as well. You talked about the Stockholm congestion charge being different to London, but we didn't really understand how it was different. So that's really not 2 questions.
So quickly on Stockholm, my reason for using it is merely that it's, although it's a lot bigger than Cambridge, it's more similar to us than London. I mean, London is a global city of 8 million people with a huge pre-existing public transport infrastructure. So it's a different sort of context. Stockholm had some of that, but is a bit more like us, and that's why I think it's an interesting example. The other thing about Stockholm is that they introduced the charge as a trial. They let it run for, I think, 14 months, and then they had a public vote on whether to retain it. And people of Stockholm said, yes, we would rather retain it, because what it did was move from an incredibly congested city with all the air quality and kind of erosion of public realm that was inherent. As soon as introduced, that massively improved. And when the vote was then held after the trial period, people didn't want to return to how it had been before, and that's why it's an interesting example. In relation to the point about equality, I think you can't solve all the problems that are attached to income inequality when you introduce something like a congestion charge. I mean, there are options that could be looked at as to how you would address particular users with particular needs, or you could provide means by which you looked at supporting through other mechanisms. But the introduction of a charge to both make it less attractive to drive and to derive revenues which allow you to invest in all the other things that you want to do is a choice you make. And I suppose London is a good example there in our own country of the charge was introduced. There are exemption categories in London, but essentially you just accept that you have to pay something towards utilising your private car in London. You have options of not using the car, which is part of the difficulty about something like the metros. It does take a while to come in, but it's why I think you would accompany any congestion charge that was supporting a metro delivery with an earlier improvement of bus and other routes, bus services and other options to sort of tide you over until the metro was actually operational. And a point about timeframes, yeah, James is right, it's longer for something like the metro. I think you'd see it as a system that build up, so you do initial north-south, east-west routes, and it become more of a fully kind of functional system over a longer period of time, but you try and get some benefits in an early stage of delivery.
And did you want to add something quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly addressing the equity thing. One of the things I like about the idea of restricting parking as a sort of, in a sense, in conjunction with a congestion charge is that in a way it's actually much fairer, because whether you're rich or poor, if there's nowhere to park, there's nowhere to park. And I think research does show that that can actually be, it's fairer. So.
Okay, I'm going to come to table 6 next, please.
A question for Alex, if that's okay. Is that okay? Yeah. So the underground makes sense for large cities. Does Cambridge have the economic capacity to build and maintain the underground system?
Yeah, so the research that was done around this in the early phase, and there's been some more work done more recently, which has been carried out through the Combined Authority and the Mayor, has looked at exactly that question. And because Cambridge has, although it's a smaller city, it is also growing very quickly. and also the numbers of people who are travelling into the sort of general city area is very significant. We're a net in commute city. More people come in than go out every day. The work's been done suggests that actually there's enough revenues from the fares that people would pay to utilise the metro system for it to, as they say, wash its face, for it to provide enough revenues to cover the costs of maintaining and operating the system. The bit that it doesn't give you enough money for is the capital costs of putting the system in, which is why I link it back to the congestion charge. The congestion charge would enable you to fund the upfront cost of delivering it. Once operational, there's enough predicted fare box revenue to mean that everything is then covered thereafter, despite us being a smaller city.
Okay, so we've not had a question for Roxanne in a little while. So, Kevin, is that a question for Roxanne? Yeah.
Hi. So we were wondering about how does cycling infrastructure work for poor weather? So what about really kind of stormy conditions or snow and that sort of stuff? Does it fall down?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been having a conversation on Twitter about this just this week. When it rains in Cambridge, it's a bit of a disaster. There are potholes everywhere, there are puddles, you get splashed in mud, and cycling's not great. But we still manage, we put on our waterproof trousers. It actually doesn't rain that much. You don't get wet as often as you think you might. But we're saying how in the Netherlands, it rains a lot more, and they cycle a lot more, and they have a saying, you're not made of sugar. You won't melt. But having cycled there in a lot of rain, it just isn't that bad. And it's because they build the infrastructure properly. You've got proper drainage. You're not cycling through puddles. You're not worried about a pothole. You're not being splashed by cars. So firstly, build the right infrastructure and to the right quality, and you significantly reduce the impact of poor weather. But also the fact is people get used to their travel behaviours. They're used to cycling to work every day. Getting into the car will take longer, or they just don't change their habits. They just put on the clothes and they get on with it. And you see that in Cambridge. I think it's a bit of a myth that people go off their bikes and into cars when it rains. It's actually that traffic slows down because of the conditions. I actually just can't think of anyone that stops cycling because of the rain. But also we've got a few other elements. If you can work from home, if you can have that bit of flexibility, you can avoid the rain shower if you need to.
Okay, coming to table 2 next, please.
Yes. Oh, can I add one very quickly? Edwin made a very good point. You can grit cycleways as well, and we have some great quad bikes that do that. But again, cycleways at the moment aren't being prioritised for the gritting. So we need, likewise for people walking.
Table 2.
Okay. Thanks, Ed. This, I think, is for James. Although other people may have an opinion as well, which is what is the primary obstacle to creating more areas that restrict private car?
Well, there isn't one. Political. If I'm honest, it's just, that's why you guys are here in this room, because it's a difficult decision to make, and the politicians aren't able to make that decision, so they're hoping you can make it for them.
So it's a political obstacle, is what you're saying. Thank you.
Can I just add that one of the things I think the two cities that we talked a bit about in relation to congestion charging, London and Stockholm, in both cases you had a mayor of that city who was prepared to go out and take a bold step of actually saying, I think this is the right thing to do. Despite the fact in London, certainly there was a significant opposition to the introduction of the charge when Ken Livingstone brought it in. Similarly, in Stockholm, the initial kind of introduction of the charge was opposed. As I said, after the kind of trial and then the vote, it turned the other way. But in both cases, you had a strong, directly elected mayor who had the political courage, I suppose, to go out and actually take the step like that.
I think we will be dealing with that a lot in the second weekend as well. But let's come to table 1 for another question, please.
So we've got a question for Edward. I think from some of your the suggested plans, we had a question that if people are already avoiding the use of public transport because of increased journey times and delays, if these are likely that they could be increased even, or journey times will be increased even more, won't that put people off more and increase congestion further?
So the objective of rerouting buses is to make the buses quicker relative to private cars. So there would be a penalty for some private car journeys because you wouldn't be able to take the most direct route that you can now. But the buses would have effectively, they would have the dedicated bus lane all the way around the city centre, which is impossible to do any other way. You know, we cannot widen streets in the city centre. So the public transport should be significantly better in terms of shorter journey times and greater reliability of journey times, which is important. And there would be a penalty for some private car trips. But the hope is that by providing a much better bus service and all the better cycling infrastructure and walking infrastructure as well, we get that what we call modal shift. So that means that people now find that they don't need to drive because there is a better alternative. So actually the volume of private vehicles trying to get into the city reduces, so then that reduces congestion. And another thing I haven't been able to talk about, but is in the last slide of the pack that I have supplied, is something called inbound flow control, where you deliberately regulate the flow of traffic at the edges of the city. And that means you can get the buses past a queue of traffic at the edge of the city, and the private traffic is held there, but the buses then get a free run into the city centre. So there are ways.
Sorry, could you just clarify, when you said penalty, is that, what do you mean by penalty? Is that time? Or?
So it's a time penalty, yeah. So it's your journey is slightly longer. And I've done some work on this, and the maximum that I've been able to establish is about 15 minutes longer for a very few exceptional journeys. But for most people, it looks like it's an average of 2 or 3 minutes longer. So we're not talking about a big penalty, time penalty for everybody, but there would be some specific journeys that you could sort of see from the map would be more difficult to make with a private vehicle.
Okay, so we've heard a bit less from Anne, John and Roxanne so far. So table 5, do you have a question for any of them?
Yep, we have a question for Roxanne, if I may. So how do you deal with the conflict between buses and cyclists? I guess the question is about the sort of safety of cyclists with all the buses manoeuvring around and past them.
Cyclists and buses should not be sharing the same road space. That's it. We have to be building better infrastructure. This legacy of cyclists and buses in the same lane just can't come in. It's not good for either user. While I'm here, we're talking about time frames. So just wanted to raise the example of Seville in Spain, where you can build a proper network, and that's really important. You need the network of cycling infrastructure very quickly, and they did this in just a few years. You need to be a bit creative, clever bollards and sort of temporary things. And now what they're doing is they're going through and putting in that really high quality infrastructure. In terms of the changes we need to make, we don't have time. We have to be doing something now, and cycling, I really do think is something we could be building a proper network incredibly quickly.
Okay, any tables with a question for either Anne or John? Oops, I'll come to this table.
Okay, that actually was a generic question, so we're going to ask you, Anne. And at the table, after each presentation, we just literally said yes. So the question is, what is stopping it being a reality?
It's political will. And this is, again, why it's really important for you guys to stand up really clearly and say, we recommend that this is what we want. And yes, everything that we propose, there will be some people who are disadvantaged, whether it's a car driver spending 2 minutes longer on a journey or fearing it's going to be 20, or somebody who has to pay a congestion charge that they have no means of avoiding. But the net benefit to all of us, to society, is enormous. So let's stand up and say, yes, we want it, and give our timid politicians the courage to actually get on with it.
So I'm actually just going to ask for a question for John next, if that's so. I'm going to come to table 8.
Thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, John, we wanted to get your views on the feasibility of the expansion of mass transit kind of out around the wider area, and in particular, if you had any views on an east-west train line.
Views in the sense of, I mean, east-west rail, I think, is coming. It's coming far more slowly. That's something we've talked about. But there is kind of an agreement that it shall happen. It's looking as if it might come into Cambridge from the south, although there are arguments for it coming in from the north. And 2 new platforms at Cambridge Station, because the current ones won't do those trains as well. Going back to the metro, actually, one suggestion that I've seen that seems to make sense is you build it basically to link the park and ride sites. You then read the number plates of the people going into the park and ride, and you find where most of them are coming from, and you then extend it to there. That does kind of seem to make sense. And perhaps we haven't talked a lot about autonomous vehicles, whether this is going to change the pattern when people perhaps no longer have to drive, when they can perhaps summon up something to come and take them. Again, this would work well in the rural areas where it's where the densities are so much lower. And you start thinking, yeah, well, that means we won't need parking at the station. And then you think, well, actually, you've got all these things coming in the morning and going back in the evening. So you will still need quite a lot of infrastructure that's perhaps not a car park, but something similar.
Okay, so we've got 6 more tables to ask a third question in about 10 minutes. So nice, quick questions, quick answers, if you please. And I think coming to Kevin's table next.
Yeah, we had another question for John, but I think you've partly just answered it. But it was around trains are really expensive just now, so that shift, is it feasible to get trains to work? Do you know, inexpensive, parking, more attractive, all of that sort of stuff? Just.
Do you mean talking about rail fares?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, rail fares are actually, again, coming in from Waterbeach, it's cheaper than the bus, I think. For all of the 20th century, it was the same price as a pint of beer, and it's now rather less. But certainly, yes, you want to keep the fares down as much as you can. You probably want to try and make the railways more efficient to get the costs down. I think there's quite a lot of scope for that. But we have the Williams Review coming, and that may or may not do something there. Sorry, what was the other part? Okay.
That's great. So coming to table 2 next. Yeah, quick answer. Sorry, quick question, quick answer.
Roxanne, it's how do we do more of what's made cycling work in Cambridge to date?
How do we do more? Look, we're making some good progress with the Greenways plans, so we need to make sure that they get funded in the future city deal, sort of tranche 2. Cross-city cycleways are coming along, but the big thing is that we're still not quite getting the whole network, and there's a program called Local Cycling and Walking Infrastructure Plans that are being worked on, so we really need to be seeing that. But it's starting to make some of the difficult decisions. We've done the easy stuff, and we're now getting to some of the junctions where we are going to have to take a bit of space to get people cycling through them safely. So we have to be a bit brave here and say we really are prioritising cycling and we're going to do it. Can I just, one tiny point, we've talked a lot about affordability of transport modes. I just want to point out the elephant in the room, that car driving is massively subsidised in this country, and that a lot of people can't afford to drive or own a car. So let's just keep that in mind too.
Okay, table 1 next.
Our questions for Roxanne as well, actually. So what are you going to do to bring cyclists within the law, and examples of clothing, insurance, etc.?
We always get one of these ones. So, gosh, it's actually quite a big question. I've come to the philosophy that cycling is still treated as a bit of an outlier or subgroup. And I think if we want to bring cyclists within the law, firstly, let's point out they're actually people riding bikes. We have people driving cars and people walking, and it's people that sometimes go outside the law in all those modes, so it's not cyclists. But we still make cycling very dangerous, so you get a subgroup of people that are probably more okay with that risk, and they may therefore be happy with taking riskier behaviours. So by first making cycling safer so that more people cycle, we get more normal people doing it, and they'll be better behaved. But we need to treat them like legitimate road users, because if you're not treated like a legitimate road user, why should you? I say you should. I stop for my red lights, but I think it's actually a bigger social issue than just cracking down on cyclists.
Okay, table 5 next.
Yep, it's a question for John. So could you say a little bit more about the community apps? Was it community apps for transport users? Your concept, what's that about? And could you just describe it a bit, please?
Okay, yeah, we're sort of not a long way through the process here, but the basic idea is firstly that just the way that Fluor communicates with its members is all rather 20th century. And, you know, we don't have anything on social media. What tends to happen, you know, when there's some problem on the railway, you get a bit of information from Network Rail and a bit from the train operators. But, you know, there are passengers on that train that's stopped or whatever, and there's a lot more information that they could give. So that's sort of one side of it. Another part of it is simply making a railway carriage a more social place. Letting someone, you know, they look at their phone and they find, there's someone 2 seats away who likes playing chess. So why don't we have a game of chess during the journey, you know? So generally that kind of thing. And yes, I was touching a bit on the idea of not just step-free access. People think that by the time you've made everything step-free, then that's all you need to do. Whereas there are certainly people who avoid public transport because they have issues which are classified as mental, but a lot of them are just the way your body reacts to an environment. So they're really more physical. And there are things you could do with the environment, but also particularly, you know, what we're going back to the subject. If the more you can get information about what it's going to be like before you get there, the better. And again, if you can put people in touch with someone who will kind of, as it were, hold their hand a bit. So that's the kind of thing we're looking for.
Great. Okay, last couple of questions. So table 6.
Thank you. So Edward, we had a statement from Roxanne about separating bikes and buses. How do bikes fit in with the loophole system? Lollipop system, sorry.
Okay, so within the city centre, within the inner ring road, we've essentially removed most of the motor vehicles. So that whole area becomes much easier to cycle and walk in. Actually, along the inner ring road, there are sections of it where the road is wide enough to be able to put in protected cycle lanes, like cycle lanes that are separated by a curb. So, for instance, Gonville Place, that runs between the Catholic Church and the Mill Road Junction. But there are other sections where the road really isn't wide enough. And the only solution to that is to provide alternative parallel routes or alternative routes. So on East Road, for instance, it's not wide enough to put in a protected cycle lane, but there is a route into the city from Norfolk Street and then through the Grafton Centre area. So we just need to make those sorts of routes, which are, you know, for what we call non-motorised users, just much easier to use, larger capacity, and more, you know, better mapped and better signed, so that people who are cycling can get around without using the roads which have to be used by large motor vehicles.
Okay, so last question from table 7, and a nice, really quick answer to this, if you please.
Hopefully. A question for James. What one thing did they do in Copenhagen that would work in Cambridge?
Well, they got rid of the cars slowly, street by street, by just taking the car parking away over 40 years, and eventually there was no room for any more cars. No one had really noticed.
Stealth.
Okay, so apparently I've miscounted and I missed out table 4 for a third question. So really, really quick question and answer.
It's a really quick question. Don't know if it's a quick answer. Our question is for Edward, and it's around mobility, in particular with the lollipop system, how people with mobility issues get from the road to the centre.
Okay, so what I drew, one of the maps was showing how far you can walk in 10 minutes. Now that does assume that you're moderately fit. It's average 2.5 miles an hour, which is a reasonable walking pace. But for people who have more restricted mobility, some of the buses do go into the city centre, and I was talking about having a shuttle service that goes between the main centres, the biomedical campus, the railway station and the city centre. So that would be a backwards and forwards that goes right into Emmanuel Street. But there is a slide in the pack of a nice picture of Ghent, where they have little electric minibuses which trundle around the whole of the city centre, and that provides that additional bit of mobility for people who really cannot walk, any great distance. So we have to have a whole mix of things. It's not, but it's rather than taking big buses right into the middle of the city centre, we take small electric buses which serve the people who really need them.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Can we say a huge thank you to our panellists? So next up is lunch, and I'm going to hand over to Suzannah to explain what's going to happen for lunch.
So lunch, as yesterday, is outside this area. We're the only people in this building, so we should have plenty of space. And Elliot, who you saw before, he is lurking, I think, by the registration table. So if you want to do a vox pop, do a little bit to camera, then go and see him. Or if you want to do, are interested in doing that something outside of the session. So the dietary requirements, as per yesterday, look out for the sheets. Okay, and back here for 1 o'clock, ready to go at 1, please. Thank you. Yeah? Oh, okay, there's some people finishing up some plates, but if I talk loudly enough, I think that they're still able to hear that. Oh, okay, food was not quite as prompt, but I think we're okay. Before we go into the next and last set of speakers, last set of speakers in this panel, I just wanted a quick check. We talked yesterday, we asked you to bring in your smartphones. Can I just have a quick show of hands so that we know where they are when we come to it later, which is at the end of the day? Anybody who doesn't have a smartphone or a tablet with them who might need to have one? Okay, so sort of a couple on each table, that's good. And so what we will do is, don't worry about that, we will get a device to you, and there will be plenty of people around who can help you to do that. It's quite simple, and there'll be lots of people who can support you with that. So before we go into the next panel as well, remember you've got your red and yellow cards, and speakers, Isabel is at the back with her timing countdown cards as well. So this morning we heard about ideas, visions, inspiration for what might happen in Greater Cambridge. In this next panel we're going to hear from Peter Blake from Greater Cambridge Partnership, talking about what's actually kind of on the books for what's in the plans currently, and a bit more about that GCP vision. And then we're going to hear from Rachel Aldred, bringing in some inspiration from outside Cambridge and beyond. So, Peter, good to go?
Indeed.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm Peter Blake from Greater Cambridge Partnership. And I've just hit the wrong button, which is just a little bit awkward.
There you go.
Should we try that one? Yeah, there we go. Okay, so what I want to do is just bring to life where the Greater Cambridge Partnership is currently with its 15-year programme, what the key issues are, and I want to try and weave in some of the points you've been thinking about over the last day or so, and I'll try and do that through the course of the presentations. So yesterday you heard from Stephen and Lynn that very much outlined the nature of the challenge that we've got, both in terms of growth, but particularly in terms of transport and traffic, and you'll remember that sort of slide that Lynn produced of cars up here and all the other modes further down. So the challenge very much is that actually for an awful lot of people, the only choice they have by way of transport is car, particularly if you live out in the rural area, you work shifts, different times of day, and the limited bus options mean that you really, there is no alternative but to the car. So we need to try and work on providing that alternative. And we need to make sure that this focuses on public transport, walking and cycling, because that makes the best use of the capacity and the network that we've had. And it preserves all the things that the previous panel were talking about in terms of what people like about Cambridge and Greater Cambridge. So not focusing on the sort of lines on the map in detail, but primarily the partnership is focusing on infrastructure delivery that tries to address this imbalance. So we're just trying to rebalance car and the other modes. So what have we been doing in the early years? Roxanne referenced some of the cycle improvements that we've been delivering. We've been working with partners on electric charging. We've reviewed some of the traffic signals systems within the city. We're about to start work on Histon Road for residents from that area in terms of public transport improvements, walking and cycling. We'll be consulting in the very near future on Madingley Road, on cycle improvements. So what happens in the course of the programme is the intervention gradually ramps up. So we then move to a series of major public transport corridors coming in from Cambourne, from Waterbeach that was mentioned in the previous session, from the Granta Park, Linton area, and then from East Cambridge. And these are entirely separate public transport, walking and cycling routes that don't interact with general traffic. So that offers some additional capacity on that. We're working very much with rail partners on Cambridge South, which is a new rail station on the biomedical campus that will deliver significant short-term improvements, because there's already a lot of people on the campus who want an alternative to being stuck on Trumpington Road trying to get to work. And then we're working with the Mayor and the Combined Authority on his plans for the metro system. And that's all terribly nice because we get to build stuff. Yeah, which when you from an engineer and my engineering background, that's great. But actually, to try and deal with the challenge that we've got, we actually can't just build our way out of it. So a lot of our recent focus has been on the services just have to get better. So I think we had a couple of points were raised yesterday about the role of the bus company. Stagecoach and you know, Stagecoach operate in our area. There are 5 or 6 very big bus companies that operate over the rest of the UK. They provide services for commercial gain. That's the regulatory regime. They don't provide services to offer public services that you and I can use. So in a Greater Cambridge context, if you were here 20 years ago and you were a bus user and you're here today, not a lot has changed. The bus network focuses on the city centre. And yet the graphs and the sort of maps that Stephen showed you yesterday is an awful lot of the growth has gone on at the biomedical campus or at the science park or at West Cambridge. And the bus network just doesn't reflect that. So in terms of commuting patterns, there's no change there. There hasn't been any investment in electric vehicles. And if you leave it purely down to a commercial operator, they're always going to have a challenge with that, because at the moment, even if you can get electric buses, they're difficult to sort of fund if they're trying to fund them all on the back of fares. We're working with Stagecoach actually to introduce 2 that should be in February, but we're trying to, if we're trying to change air quality and deal with the air quality issues, we need to address that as an issue. Step change in investment in walking and cycling. I think Roxanne and some of the others mentioned that this morning. So that is about fundamentally changing our approach to cycling. It's not about putting a white line on and calling it a cycleway. It's about reallocating the space that we've got. David's mentioned a few times the digital issues, so in terms of development of apps. I've mentioned traffic signals. We're going through a process of upgrading all of them, linking to automation. Wouldn't it be nice if the traffic signals linked to the real-time bus information? So that was always correct. So that's work that we're doing. And then CAM and Cambridge South that I've mentioned previously. So I'm hoping, do I press again? This is going to show me something, or show you something.
Greater Cambridge is on the move. An ambitious programme of sustainable, technology-driven enhancements will revolutionise travel over the next 30 years. Greater Cambridge is a world-leading centre for research, innovation and technology. It is the fastest growing city in the UK today and helps power the national economy. Despite above average number of homes being built, prices continue to rise in the city, which means more people are now travelling longer distances to work here. This is putting pressure on our roads and public transport. Traffic congestion is rising, and poor air quality is becoming an increasingly pervasive threat to our health. We're developing a better, greener transport network for Greater Cambridge that will give you good alternatives to using your car to get you where you need to be, reliably, affordably and easily. That means more efficient buses and more cycling in the next 5 years. But in the longer term, a brand new metro system will provide fast and efficient travel between residential and employment areas, crossing parts of the city underground. There are also plans for a 3rd railway station at Cambridge South, providing easy access to the biomedical campus and beyond. A new east-west rail route linking Cambridge to Milton Keynes and Oxford will open up large areas to and from the west that have traditionally been difficult to access. Greater Cambridge will be even better connected to the wider region and the whole of the UK. Shorter-term improvements include a series of travel hubs for people to switch from car to non-car travel. Public transport routes designed to work 24/7 and future-proof to adapt as technology evolves. Using new innovation solutions to ease your journeys. More cycleways to allow people to cycle safely around the city and from surrounding towns and villages. When is this happening? It's already begun. Public transport routes can be used for autonomous vehicles and then CamMetro in the future. The solutions we build now will become the foundation for the solutions of tomorrow, meeting the need and demand in the short, medium and long term.
Always looks great in the glossy video, doesn't it? Two particular issues. First two bullet points I need to focus on. If we're going to deliver a lot of this stuff, we need to create the space. And certainly in the tight city environment, that is difficult. That means if we're going to give more space to cyclists, we have to take space off other modes. And we need to do that consciously and understand what the impact is. And that's one of the challenges that we've got, particularly as 86% of people are currently travelling by private car. The second is, to deliver a transformed public transport network, there needs to be some funding to do that. And we sit here and go, you've got £500 million. You can afford that, surely. Actually, the infrastructure improvements that we're looking at will cost £500 million and more. What we need to do is to focus on how we can afford, how do we get better bus services in the evening in the rural areas? How do we get bus services that serve the biomedical campus better and the Cambridge Science Park better? So that's part of the challenge. We've got an opportunity with the funding through the city deal to make best use of that and deliver some of this stuff, but we really need to answer those two questions about how are we going to better use our road space and how are we going to make sure that we can't just build a new busway, but there are actually more buses on it. So this is the challenge that I've been set by my executive board, and you might recognise some of this in terms of the question that you've been asked to consider. So they've said to me, develop a package of proposals. Promote public transport, promote walking and cycling, and manage the use of the car. But we'd also like you to consider that we want you to look at both congestion and air quality. And I think what came out, or started to come out yesterday, is they don't necessarily point in the same direction. Ban buses and ban diesel vehicles from the city centre improves air quality. It doesn't necessarily resolve congestion because there are no buses to go in there. So we've got to look at electric vehicles and we've got to try and manage that dynamic. We need to improve the opportunity and accessibility. I'm about to get timed out, so I'm going to go quick. Final one's the important one. I think we touched upon this morning around some of the charging issues. How are these things, how is this package fair and equitable? So how does it fare to people in South Cambridgeshire and in Cambridge, and indeed if you're from Ely or you're from Essex or Hertfordshire travelling in, how do we make it fair? How do we make it fair for different age groups, and how do we make it fair with any financial incentives or otherwise that we come up with? Thank you.
It is. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Peter. So we have got one more speaker in Rachel, but I know that you might just want to spend 30 seconds jotting down some questions. So if you do that now, and we can slowly ask Rachel to stand up. Okay. Right, Rachel, do you want to take the floor?
Brilliant, thank you. Is it all right if I stand over by the lectern, or is that going to cause trouble?
That's okay.
That's good? Okay, brilliant, thank you. Because I am an academic and I like to be near lecterns. I am a reader, not, unfortunately, as it says over there, a professor, but I am currently putting in my case for chair, so I'll take this as a good omen. I was asked to talk about future visions and scope for change, which I was really excited by because I think this is such an important topic. I recently wrote a qualitative paper looking at basically kind of barriers to getting a shift towards more sustainable transport in terms of how people think about transport. And it became clear that it's very hard for us to imagine things being different. And that for me is one of the most important barriers. People don't necessarily like what things are like now, but it's hard for us to imagine things being different. So that's really what I'm trying to get across here in the next 14 minutes, is a kind of sense of the scope of change. The first point I wanted to make is that we are living just after an extraordinary social transition, which in my view should make us think that things have changed and can change again. My background is sociology, actually. I'm not a transport engineer or anything by background. And looking back on my sociology degree, it is incredible how we studied, feudalism, capitalism, women's liberation. We studied all these changes. We didn't talk about the car. We didn't talk about one of the most substantial shifts to have taken place in the past 100 years. But this is incredible. So this is distance travelled annually by car in red, and I've also put in cycling, which is in green. And look at the scale of the change. In 1952, we were effectively a multimodal society. Distance travelled by different modes was fairly similar. Obviously, different people travelling, potentially, but distance travelled by different modes fairly similar. And distance travelled by car over the next 40 years just took off. Everything else declined and was left behind. So really, really massive change. If you think about what that implies, a society where you assume everyone has cars compared to a society where you assume hardly anyone does, they're very different types of society. The other thing that I found staggering when I got into this area as well, one other thing, I could do a similar graph for other modes, but this one is just for cycling. This is distance travelled annually by cycle, so it's the line you couldn't see on the previous graph. And 1952 to 1962, basically in 10 years, at a national level, this country eradicated cycling. It was so quick. It fell off a cliff. In 1949, a third of traffic on the roads was bikes. Within 15 years, that was 2%. It completely collapsed. And these changes were planned for. I could talk for an hour or more about this, but these changes were planned for, and they were effective, and they were quick. The way people travel can change really rapidly. Second point I wanted to make is that as a sociologist, I'm really interested in everyday experiences. And one of the things that is fascinating about public space and the streets and the roads is that messages are constantly sent saying, use a car. And we often don't notice this because we're so used to it, because it's just every day. So for instance, the fact that if you're a pedestrian, you have to press a button and wait to cross a road. It is the pedestrian that gives way to the driver, not the driver that regularly gives way to the pedestrian. And we don't think about these things, but it becomes part of how we understand travel and transport. We've built major roads, even in inner cities, that speeds motor traffic. Well, it often doesn't speed it, it pushes it through residential areas. And pedestrians very often are pushed out of the way of motor traffic. This environment sends us messages every day about who matters, about which modes of transport are normal and which are not normal. And I think it's really important to make this point. Peter was talking about fairness, which is crucial. We need fairness and social justice in the change we're trying to make. But it's important to note the current system is deeply unfair. The people who suffer most from the side effects of the amount of car use we have are the most vulnerable. The young, the old, disabled people, people who live in poor areas, people who often don't own a car. What got me really fascinated in this topic was I was studying actually that area and it became apparent that many of those people in those buildings didn't own cars, but most of their kids had asthma. Why? Because we were prioritising the driving of those people past their houses. So it's really important to understand that there's big inequities at present, I think. Just another example. this tells us, and this happens all the time, this happens when I travel into central London. Every time there is some kind of disruption, who shall we inconvenience? Well, the pedestrians and the cyclists. They can cross the road. We mustn't take any space from motor traffic. These are decisions made by construction companies, by utility companies, by traffic engineers every day, and they send messages to us about who matters. And this whole thing is the kind of thing we need to change to be able to imagine an alternative. It's also there in transport modelling tools, in transport planning practices. Decades of this, decades of assumptions about what you do. So for instance, where I live in London, one of the big barriers to change is that a 20-second delay for motorists on an A road is basically ranked as more important than air pollution problems for children that live in those local neighbourhoods. That is the way that the decision-making system works, and that's why it's so exciting, this kind of event, people coming together to think, what do we want? How do we want it to be different? I had to mention this. Getting here to the Muller Centre, this made me laugh. They start off by telling you there's free on-site parking for 140 cars, and then a little bit lower down, they are committed to reducing carbon emissions. Please consider using public transport. Hey, there's loads of car parking, but if you're a good person, you might come by a different mode. And this is really the kind of assumption that is embedded in a lot of policy making. Most people will drive, but some weird people are possibly going to use other methods of transport. But on the positive side, things, as I said, have changed quickly. Things can change again really quickly. I don't think we should assume that we have to wait generations for change. This table at the top is from it's a parliamentary report on active travel, and it's really interesting that even though we've got all this large amount increase in driving, that have levelled off now, but that big increase, still nearly all trips are under 10 miles. The majority of trips are not long trips, and in fact, around 2/3 of trips are under 5 miles, which potentially are the kind of trips that could be considered for walking or cycling. But the car dominates even these journeys. So even for journeys between 1 and 2 miles, more than half of them, people use their car. For trips of 2 to under 5 miles, the car is dominant. So this is hopeful. Obviously the current situation is not good, but there's an awful lot of short trips that potentially, if things were changed, people could make differently. Just to give you an example from here, so this is a map of how children get to school in Cambridgeshire from a tool that I'm involved in called Propensity to Cycle tool. So you can see one of the things that's really hopeful here is that there are a lot of children cycling to schools, you probably know, in Cambridge, in Huntingdon already. But most of the area, the rates of children cycling to school are around 3 or 4%, which is much more like the national picture. So we have seen increases, we do see higher rates, but mostly it's not that high. However, this is our calculation of what cycling to school might look like in Cambridgeshire if school children were as likely as Dutch kids to cycle to school in terms of distance and hilliness. So basically, if it's a 2-mile trip to school up a hill, what if children here were as likely to cycle that as Dutch children would be? And you see it, completely different picture that for most of the region, you're seeing 40 or 50% of kids are cycling to school. So again, it's not, despite policies of school choice, despite lengthening distances in some regards, we still have an awful lot of short trips that could potentially be made differently. I've just recently, when I got here at lunchtime, found that you'd already talked about Seville, but I only have a little bit on Seville, so hopefully you can cope with hearing about it again. This is just a broader picture. This is for cycling again, but we've also seen big changes in use of public transport as well that I could have shown. So these are certain cities and changes in cycling mode share. These changes are quite quick. So, for instance, Copenhagen and Amsterdam, within 15 or 20 years, they'd gone from 23% cycling to 35% cycling. So actually, even in places with a lot of cycling, you've seen some quite substantial change relatively quickly, where those cities had chosen to invest and chosen to prioritise. I wanted to briefly give the example of Seville, though. Seville went from 0.5% to 8% cycling mode share in 15 years. So they didn't have to wait several generations. They got a really substantial change in 15 years. This may look idyllic, but if you know Seville, if you've ever been there in summer, you know the temperature is often 35 degrees or hotter in the summer. Now, I'm a Preston girl, so I'm used to the rain. I would rather cycle in the rain than in 35 degrees any day, I have to say. They have very high temperatures, and of course the argument there would be it's too hot, people won't cycle. There is always a reason why people won't cycle, they won't walk, they won't use public transport, and in Seville it was because it's too hot. But we saw an extraordinary change in Seville in terms of how people travelled. And this is why. In Seville, in 2005, that's the network of bike paths that they had in their city. In 2010, when you'd seen the chunk of the increase, you basically have a network. It's not a perfect network, but you have a network. Within 5 years, they made a big change to the infrastructure in Seville. And within 10 years, they had a big change in terms of how people travelled. Which leads me to my final point. Good timing. Bold and consistent policy and messaging are needed. We really, what we've learned, I think, in terms of the sustainable travel field is that change is possible, but it won't just happen. If we tiptoe around, it's not just going to happen. Things could instead get worse. But if bold decisions are made, people will change the way they travel. And I wanted to highlight as well that there is not really an effective strategy that depends only on carrots and not on sticks. In fact, I don't think there are very many effective carrot policies, i.e. policies that encourage people that don't involve making it harder or putting people off driving. So one of the things that traditionally in this country we did for cycling was to paint a bicycle symbol on narrow pavements. That is not a good carrot. It doesn't involve taking space from cars, but it doesn't make things better for anyone. Or for instance, to tell people, as in the description of how to get here, if you're a good person, you will use public transport, you will cycle, you will walk. Those kind of things don't really make a dent. They don't really change the options that people are offered. They don't really make a difference. But on the positive side, stick policies are often not really sticks, because the kind of environments we get where cars are dominant are often unpleasant, polluted environments that don't even work well for driving. This is Portland in the 1950s, and obviously it looks classically American, but this is right by the harbour. This was a massive freeway, and the stick policy, in a sense, is to get rid of that freeway. People can no longer drive through that area in the way they used to. And this is what it's led to. It's led to an environment that is much more pleasant, that is a carrot into travelling more sustainably. It's been made a bit harder to drive there, with the result that you've got a much more pleasant environment that encourages travel in other ways. In Seville, where did they get the space for the bike paths from? They took it from car parking. In fact, they took an awful lot of car parking out across the whole of Seville, making it harder to park there, but then making it easier and more pleasant to walk and cycle. The two things went together, making it a little bit harder to drive and making it easier to use alternative forms of transport. In London, in relation to public transport, in London they took out 25% of road space from central London for private cars between 1996 and 2008. That is massive. They took out space for private cars, they gave it to bus lanes, they gave it to pedestrians, the pedestrianisation of parts of central London, but also taking away car lanes and giving them to buses. So really massive shift in terms of space allocation. That space, there was nowhere else to take it from. That space had to come from cars if you were going to reallocate it in that way. And this is the extraordinary thing that accompanied it. This is trips per person in London by private motorised transport and by public transport. And the red line is car trips basically per day, and the green line is public transport trips per day over that period. In 1996, people were making twice as many trips in London by car as by public transport. In 2013, that crossed over, and actually people are now making more trips by public transport. That was a change that happened in really around 15 years, and really quite a seismic change in how people behave. And just to finish, an example of Waltham Forest in suburban London. So this is a sort of carrot and stick again. This is before, this is an intersection that you can drive through in a neighbourhood, and this is after. It's meant to be a public square for the people who live there. It's also somewhere you can walk and cycle through easily. It's taken space away from driving through, and it's meant that people can now travel, people can now experience that differently. So my final slide, just to reinforce the point about changes have an effect. This is our evaluation of this programme of interventions. And what we found was that parts of these boroughs where interventions hadn't happened, so mini Holland boroughs in London, but ones where they hadn't made changes on the ground, we didn't find a statistically significant increase in active travel. However, the red bars are the places where they'd made changes like this, and we found that people were walking and cycling 40 to 45 minutes more a week in those areas. So just telling people you're in a mini Holland borough didn't seem to have that much effect, but actually making changes on the ground meant that people were travelling differently from what they had done before. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. You took us around the world there, and that was amazing. Thank you. So back to your table groups. We're just going to give you 10 minutes or so to come up with some priority questions. I think if you can narrow it down to one per speaker, then we should get through everybody. Okay? Good. Thank you. And I think there's more flapjacks out there today. Okay. Yeah. Woo! Is everyone ready? Good enough? Yeah. Table 1. I've forgotten where table 1 is. Is that you, Lizzie? Lizzie, have you got a question for Rachel?
Yes, we do. So one of our main questions was around how can we educate people about the different options or solutions. I think you talked a lot about behavioural change and that sort of thing. How can we encourage that more? We put incentives as an example, but are there other ways?
So you're asking about the most effective ways to get people to change their behaviour?
Sorry. What you were telling us today, a lot of people probably aren't aware of that. So how are you going to get that information across to the general public? And or incentives to do it?
I mean, I think the belief that change can happen and must happen is really important. I think if we can get that across to people, and I think that is partly a question of political leadership as well, of it being clear that things have to change, things can't go on the way they have been doing, and that, in my opinion, was really important in London. It wasn't actually pushed. It wasn't so much that active and sustainable transport initially, it's a nice, healthy add-on thing to have. It was kind of like, we're going to have 2 million more people at least in London. We simply can't cope. Something has to change. So it was kind of, I think that then got conveyed that things do need to change. I mean, in terms of for instance, incentives, I would agree that we could be doing much more around that. We see, for instance, I was talking at lunchtime around, we're talking about e-bikes, like pedal-assisted e-bikes, and there are other European countries that are doing a lot more to incentivize people to use pedelec e-bikes than is happening in this country. So it's all part of the picture. It's all part of trying to create a situation where people feel they have options and that those options are better for them, or at least as good for them as driving would be. And I think we have to think of the whole picture, and from day-to-day street interactions to people's financial, whether things, whether they can afford to use the bus and so on. So it's the whole thing. And I really think that encouraging people to change their behaviour is really not primarily a case of saying you should do this differently, but actually changing the situation a whole range of ways so that they have options.
Great, thank you. Rachel. So, table 2, have you got a question for Peter?
We have, and Peter, it's actually the one that we asked for the content clarification from you, which people felt should be shared with the wider room, the way it was worded was, if GCP already have all these plans, what are we here for?
Good question, and thanks for the forewarning. So what I was trying to convey earlier on is that there's an infrastructure plan. We're going to build some stuff. But actually, if you build all of that stuff, that doesn't resolve the challenge that we've got. You know, just putting on more cycleways from the villages into the city, putting on more segregated bus systems, that will in itself not mean that enough people change their mode to deal with the challenge that we've got, because there's an awful lot of people that will drive the car, and an awful lot of people will always drive a car. What we're looking at is to try and change that balance. So the question that being put to you is very much to assist with the decision makers to how do we change that balance, and how do we look at very much the use of the road space, how do we look at how we can improve public transport services, not public transport infrastructure, that really supports that change.
Great, thank you. Table 3, question for Rachel?
Yeah, we just wondered if there was any examples from around the world of kind of employers, private investment, universities, providing adequate funding to provide some of the money to do this shift towards active travel, so providing cycleways and all of that sort of stuff.
I think, I mean, there's examples whereby governments have through through different kind of Section 102 or different kinds of agreements where local authorities, city authorities have got money off companies that is then used towards sustainable transport. So there's some good examples of that, including in this country, but also increasingly what you see is companies seeing that the future is not the car, and actually actively saying, we want to invest in other modes, we want the city to, or sometimes we want the city to provide alternative modes. And there's some interesting examples, for instance, around Google in the West Coast US, where they're actually going out and saying, we'll provide these cycleways, we'll provide these buses and so on. One of the things that concerns me personally around equity with some of those things, of course, is that some local authorities will have greater pulling power than others. And you see, for instance, in London, the City of London has some really radical plans around freight and servicing. And one of the reasons they're able to do that is because they have loads of employers that go, we want to be in City of London. So City of London can then turn around and say, well, if you want to be in City of London, you cannot be bringing these HGVs on our streets. So I think that this is happening, but I think I would worry that some authorities might be left behind because they don't have that power.
Thank you. Table 4, question for Peter.
Peter, okay, so back to your plan. So where are you on the plan? At what stage are you?
So in terms of the infrastructure, a lot of the infrastructure plan has been broadly agreed in principle, and now we're working through with consultation phases on the detailed design of Camborne to Cambridge, or of the Waterbeach corridor, of greenways. So a lot of the infrastructure is in train. Bearing in mind this is a 15-year program, so some of this thing takes a time to deliver. The question that the executive board will consider in December is, what about this softer side of using the sort of the road space that we've got, providing better services that will complement the infrastructure. So they're going to particularly consider how we manage access in and around the city environment in a December paper. So what you come up with will form part of the considerations in the December political cycle.
Sorry, just wait for the mic.
Sorry, we're in about year 4. And so an awful lot of the time and effort at the moment has been developing the plan, getting clear list of priorities, starting that initial engagement on schemes. So we small level cycle schemes have gone in, and that is now beginning to ramp up, and the schemes will get bigger over time because larger schemes just take longer to deliver.
Okay, table 5. Have you got a question for Rachel?
We sure do. So we had quite a conversation about safety and also sort of, I guess, perceptions of where it's safe to travel. So a specific question that came out of that conversation was, statistically, do you know, is it less safe to travel with your child on the back of your bike So to cycle with your child on the back, or to have your child in the car with you. So there's a perception that actually it's unsafe to travel on the road with your child on a bike, and so people feel I have to put my child in a car to keep them safe. But actually, do the stats bear out that risk to the child of modes of transport?
I think one of the things that this is something that one could talk about at great lengths. There's different ways of sort of discussing the injury statistics and presenting the injury statistics. I mean, cycling, in this country, cycling is not as safe as it should be. In the Netherlands, it's around three times safer, so it could be quite a lot safer, and that would, I think, increase the likelihood that people are willing to cycle, and they're willing to cycle with their children, because also when you have separated cycleways, when you have safer neighbourhood streets, people feel it's more attractive, as well as it actually being safer. But it's also important, I think, to take into account health, physical activity and health benefits and so on, because of course one of the problems, the major societal problems that we're having, is that many people, including children but also older people and all of us, are not getting the physical activity, the exercise that we need as part of our daily lives. It's not built into our work. It's not something that we now we don't get physical activity going to and from work often, and the chief medical officers all kind of agree that the easiest way to get physical activity is to build it into everyday life. So if children are cycling to school, if people are walking to the bus stop to get to work and so on, there's really important physical activity benefits, and at a societal level the physical activity benefits far outweigh the injury impacts of walking cycling, even in the current situation of it not being as safe as it should do. However, people don't feel it's safe, and they need to feel it's safe in order to get out there and get on their bike, or in some cases walk.
Thank you. And table 6, question for Peter.
So you talked, Peter, about the 400 million that's been allocated. How much of that has already been spent or allocated into certain areas?
So we receive this in essentially three funding streams. So 100 million takes us to the end of this financial year. Second wave, 200 million to 2024, and then final wave of 200 million to the end of the programme. At the moment, we've spent broadly about 70 million in terms of the developments, in terms of things like the sort of cycle schemes, Histon Road scheme that will commence in the next couple of months, and the like. But what happens over time, because the schemes get larger, they get significantly more expensive. And if you go beyond our programme of 5 million, so conscious I showed on the video a tunnel, great idea, a tunnel under Cambridge, probably going to cost about 1.5, 1.6 billion. So what you get is it might cost you several $100,000 for a cycle lane, up to the better part of £2 billion for part of a metro system. Excuse me. So the infrastructure projects will ramp up, but 500 million, which is a huge amount of money, will only take us so far.
Okay, table 7, question for Rachel.
How would you practically do the messaging to make someone change from car to public transport?
I mean, I think, as kind of before, I think it has to be a societal conversation, which is why this is such a good thing. It has to be a political and policy conversation. It has to be... people have to see that they have different options, but they also have to understand that there is a need for a big societal shift in behaviour. And I think we should be honest about the fact that there may be, at least in the short term, some disbenefits. But when we do surveys, when we ask people about would they be willing to be delayed slightly in their car if it meant that there could be a safe cycleway or whatever, people are surprisingly willing to say yes, at least in that survey context. And I think if we're honest with people that, yes, sorry, you may have to wait an extra couple of minutes if you still want to drive to work, but on the other hand, there will be all these benefits and there will be more alternatives for you. Because I think one of the things that we're seeing is really a shift away from people wanting to drive, and we can see that particularly young people, young men, the amount young men drive has halved. People don't necessarily want to drive. Driving, 50, 70 years ago was a very different experience. Driving now, you look at the car ads, it's nothing like that. It's often frustrating, annoying, and tedious. And actually, when you look at commute satisfaction, people who walk or cycle have the highest commute satisfaction because because inherently it's actually a nicer way to travel. So we need to make it possible for people. And we need, I think, to have a conversation about the kind of support people need and the kind of changes that people need, which may not necessarily be what we expect. So for instance, maybe there are changes around times that people work, or maybe there are changes around childcare. Maybe there are things that would make it easier for people to live without a car. So I think we need to have a conversation about that, and a conversation about what kind of journeys by car are really necessary and which are not, and how as a society do we prioritise. So just to give you a very quick example, you know, in London, for instance, for some disabled people, taxis are a really important mode of mobility. However, 95% of taxi journeys basically are made by people who could have alternatives. Most taxi journeys are made by people who effectively are kind of affluent white men, many of them. And how do we prioritise the journeys made by disabled people, and how do we prioritise them having more access to mobility, while at the same time saying, well, sorry, you know, a business person going to a work meeting should not be in a bus lane getting sped up in a private motor vehicle. We need to have these kind of discussions, I think.
Quick, really quick one, Peter.
I mean, just to add, this is a balance. If the bus service isn't very good, or the cycling experience isn't very good, we can't just suggest to people, oh, you go get on your bike, it'll be fine. You know, actually, there's a balance package that says, yes, we need people to be as informed as they can be, but we do need to be making things better. So better cycle lanes, changing and washing facilities at colleges or at their employees. You know, we have to look at the whole experience and improve that.
Hold on to the microphone. Table 8, question for Peter.
Thanks very much. Like some of the other tables, we were really interested in the realism, timeframe, costs of the plan that you've outlined already. In particular, the thing that we don't think has been picked up yet was the role of the east-west rail link, either the kind of Oxford-Cambridge kind of one that's being talked about, or anything that goes further east than that. Timescale, realism, costs.
You're asking the wrong person. So a government-sponsored project, a private company is developing proposals for that, linked to the development of an arc between Oxford and Cambridge. That will inevitably bring further growth way in excess of what Stephen was talking about yesterday. The published timescales are for at some point in the next decade. I would be hesitant about that because delivering a project of that nature is hugely challenging. So I think we can expect detailed proposals later in the year, and I think at that point they will update the timetable in terms of what's realistic.
Okay, right. For this next round of questions, which I think we're going to squeeze in, but under some conditions, speakers, you're going to have to give a really pithy answer. Table facilitators, if you feel that question has already been covered, move on, okay? We're time between flapjacks now. So, table 1, a question for Peter.
So people visit Cambridge for the look of the city and historical buildings. How will it impact tourism and visitors if you change the look and modernise it, this historical town, with transport options, etc.?
You're trying to work with the grain. You're trying to ensure that it supports and develops all that is good about Greater Cambridge that people like. What we're trying to do is to offer genuine alternatives so people just don't use the same mode of transport that they're using at the moment.
Table 2. Rachel.
So a question for Rachel. It's a yes-no answer. Are more demographics changing mode in the wake of the sort of infrastructure changes you outlined in your talk?
It's in terms of demographics, a lot of the studies, it's hard when you start drilling down and looking at different demographic groups because you lose statistical power then to look at uptake, which is the problem I've had with my study. We did find some evidence that women seem to be more sensitive to men than men to those infrastructure changes in relation to cycling. So, yeah. Age groups. In terms of studies I've done, I haven't found an age effect, and it's worth pointing out that there's a big difference in terms of participation by older people in cycling, certainly in this country, compared to countries that have much better infrastructure for cycling. But in terms of the causal evidence is maybe not that strong looking at individual interventions.
Thank you. Table 3, Peter.
Has the guided bus route actually reduced traffic on the A14?
It's difficult to assess one public transport corridor and one road. If you take a step back on the guided bus, actually, in patronage terms, has been enormously successful. And it's the one area that has consistently grown in numbers over the last 5-6 years. I think the last reported year was 7% increase in patronage. And actually, the problem on the guided bus network at the moment is actually, it's too busy, and there aren't simply enough buses there at the moment to deal with the situation at peak times.
Thank you. Table 4, question for Rachel.
Rachel, how much did Seville invest to achieve that change?
It was, I don't have the exact number off the top of my head, but it was a substantial amount. However, the way they did it is worth thinking about, because they put in sort of large concrete armadillo blocks, which is a relatively cheap way of taking space quickly from cars and reallocating them to walking and cycling. Mexico City has done similar. So I don't think money is the main barrier often. You can do these things without spending quite as much as Transport for London spent on the East-West Cycle Superhighway. So yeah, they did put money in, but it wasn't as expensive as you might have thought. So.
Table 5, question for Peter.
It's very difficult for some sectors of the economy to make these modal shifts. So we were thinking about things like commercial vehicles, trade deliveries, hauliers. So where do they feature in this strategy for?
They're a key component. So, we're looking at all road users. And so we had the conversation yesterday, didn't we, about electric vehicles? So clearly there are issues there that we need to progress in terms of charging or working with manufacturers on the capacity for new vehicles coming in. We need to look at loading times. Are we saying particular times of the day or days of the week? And are we actively enforcing loading areas? So a loading drop zone is a loading drop zone. It's not parking there for an hour to nip to the shops. So I think there's a number of things that we can do with some of the main providers. Can they geo-fence some of their vehicles coming in? Can we get consolidation sites on the outskirts of town? Why can't we have a park and ride side that encourages freight operators to gather at one point, go onto one vehicle rather than 10, and then deliver into the city? So we need to think that they are part of the solution, and how do we engage and encourage that?
Okay, I've just realised my epic fail. It's not flapjacks next. Sorry. Sorry. You have to do a bit of work before you get your flapjacks. Why did no one point that out to me? Why did I have to realise that by myself? Okay, table 6, question for Rachel.
So your ideas were great for shorter distances. So our table was looking at how will the interconnectivity work for longer distances? So maybe in more rural areas.
Yeah, no, good question. And one of the things, just to answer in relation to cycling, because that's the active travel mode with more scope, you would be surprised by how high a proportion of trips in rural areas are still potentially within scope for cycling, particularly when you consider pedelecs and e-bikes. It's not the case that most trips, for instance, recently I looked at Ireland, which is quite rural, outside of Dublin. Still, half of all trips were under 5 miles. There's still an awful lot of trips that potentially could be switched, which would then potentially free up space for those trips that do still need to be made by motorised modes. Also, as well, public transport. And potentially, we need to do more to encourage people to use cycles alongside public transport, which is something that's more established in places like Germany and the Netherlands than it is here. But there is going to be higher potential for shift to active modes in urban areas, that is true, but there's still quite a lot of potential in rural areas as well. If you look at the Netherlands, for instance, the mode share in rural areas for cycling is actually pretty high, and perhaps not surprisingly, because there's probably, the public transport is not so good, so cycling then becomes more attractive.
Thank you. Table 7, question for Peter.
We're still a little bit cynical here about what's already been decided by GCP and what's up for grabs. So with that in mind, is the metro a proposal, or is it a definite part of the plan?
No, the metro is a proposal. Will take probably 10 to 15 years to deliver and require a significant amount of funding. So the tunnelling bid is over £1.5 billion, and if you go further out, to St Neots or Huntingdon, the costs go up significantly. So the conversation around the Greater Cambridge Partnership Board is around what do we need to do in addition to infrastructure. How do we revolutionise the public bus network, and how can we afford to do that? How do we make buses a realistic mode of choice in our rural area? Because we can't have conventional buses travelling everywhere. So is it some sort of demand responsive that link in with the main bus that jumps on the guided busway that gets the time advantage? What are the options there? And what do we need to do about rebalancing our use of road space? And I thought that the photograph from Seville with the parked cars kind of just says it all. So you can choose to have parked vehicles, or you could get rid of them and do something else with it. And so they're the things, and that's the thinking that's going on at the moment.
Thank you. Table 8, question for Rachel.
Thank you. Rachel, the table were very appreciative of your clarity. Our softball question was, when are you going to become Transport Minister? But our real question, which is a bit less softball, is where car parking spaces have been taken away in Walthamstow and Seville and things like that, where do the people who used to park their cars there park their cars now?
I think it depends on the context. I mean, in London, I would have to say in London, Andrew Gilligan, the former cycling commissioner, famously said it's the third rail, touch it and you die. So car parking often in London, where schemes have been put in for walking and cycling, have actually redistributed car parking spaces rather than taking them away entirely. I think what you often find, in analysis, looking at the usage of car parking spaces, it's not always what you would expect. And I was talking to transport planners from Camden, and they were saying, for instance, that often local businesses sort of express concern that people won't be able to do their shopping because if the car parking spaces go, when you actually look at the usage of the car parking spaces, it is the people who own those local businesses who are parking there, and which is a slightly different issue. And so potentially there's some mode shift. Potentially those car parking spaces were not actually being used by the people you think they were, but often potentially car parking can be reallocated, and the Mini Holland schemes in London, because they saw this as quite a problem, have reallocated some of the car parking spaces. And potentially for some of those people then, if it becomes slightly, if it becomes slightly more attractive to walk and it becomes slightly further to walk from the car, sometimes, and my qualitative work has picked up with some of these, that just tips a few people to stop driving, and then that frees up the car parking space, and then you can do something more with that space. So I think sometimes it's about creating a virtuous circle, which can be difficult to measure and separate the impacts, but you kind of know when it's happening, hopefully.
So can I just give a sort of an operational view on that? And I work with Andrew Gilligan on a couple of those schemes in London. These are divisive questions. So people are genuinely concerned if they lose some element of utility. We're doing a much smaller scheme on Histon Road at the moment. We have to legally advertise a traffic order that takes away parking, and I have a number of objections from local businesses and local residents that are concerned. And that just brings to life some of the dilemmas that we need to consider when we do this stuff.
Thank you, Peter and Rachel. I think we need to give them another round of applause. And I apologise again for the flapjack incident. So what we're going to do now is you're going to do some work at your tables. So yesterday you were immersed in impacts, and today we want you to think about vision. And the future vision for Greater Cambridge that has addressed that question that we have for the Assembly. So, and your table facilitator will go through this. What do we want to achieve in Greater Cambridge by 2030? So we need to put you in your TARDIS, take you to 2030, and that's not one of the sustainable mobility options, I think, the TARDIS, and think about what it is that you want. Okay? I am going to force the table facilitators to come up with about 3 to 5. So you'll have the discussion, but then you'll come up with 3 to 5 options that represent that range on your table. Before you do that, do you remember yesterday we talked about the impacts, and up on the walls are the collated list of the impacts. So you fed back to us what your range of views were. We looked at those last night. We've got all of that detail, but what we saw was that there were some overlaps, and I just want to really quickly run through them. I think, we said that the impacts we most want to address are the time wasted by people by being stuck in traffic and the lost opportunity to do other things, the health impacts of poor air quality, particularly for children and vulnerable people, the quality of life and well-being impacts of congestion, so that stress and other sort of frustrations that come from it. We want to address the lack of reliable, effective public transport service across the whole area, the effects on wildlife and natural environment. We also want to address limited parking spaces and costs of parking. So, you know, there are people who still have car use as part of the mix, let's not forget that. And impacts from the lack of joined up transport options that stop you making effective route planning choices. We want to address the risk to cyclists and pedestrians due to poor infrastructure, skills and crowded road space. Address the school run congestion, that sort of stood by itself as a sort of an issue. The poor maintenance of existing infrastructure, for example, in bike lanes. And then there was the impacts of what we sort of term the growing pains of Greater Cambridge's growth. That balance between the increasing economy and population and infrastructure and services keeping up with that. We wanted to address non-inclusive transport design, and that green alternatives are expensive, so the electric vehicles, public transport. And the economic and organisational, addressing the economic and organisational impacts of congestion. So the time lost to businesses and that idea of normalisation of lateness being built into sort of hospital appointments, for example. And a lack of awareness of alternative travel choices we want to address. And a lack of joint planning and coordination of infrastructure and built development. So the wider things apart from just the transport side of things. So that's still quite a long list, but we have collapsed into there lots of the ideas that you had yesterday. And this is just a reference point for you now when you're looking at, okay, so those are the things that we want to address. So what do we want to achieve in Greater Cambridge by 2030? What does our vision for transport look like? Question over there. Yes. Can somebody get a... Maybe I'll run over to you. Yeah.
There is one in here about the expensiveness of public transport separately. So it's not really, but it's already there separately as well.
Expensiveness of electric.
Yeah. Okay, I think we did have affordability in there somewhere, but yes, it was definitely a theme that came out, and I will just add it in. Thank you. So, sorry. So now I'm going to hand over to the table facilitators, and you have got about 40 minutes, okay? Go. So, while everybody else is eating cookies and having tea, Tim and Kayla are next door scurrying around and trying to get your different ideas from the tables into a list that we will prioritise, and that's why we will need the smartphones, but I will come to that. So while that is just happening, I wanted to introduce David Metz, who you've seen through the 2 weekends. And David's going to, and I've realised I don't think I have given him the clicker, is going to give us a little intro into travel demand, transport and supply. So we're starting to move into the stuff that's a bit more difficult now. And David's going to tee us up for some of those choices.
So, because we want to move, to be mobile, we create a demand for travel, and the transport system meets that demand. It's the supply side. And so what I'm talking about is the everyday face of the underlying economics of the transport system.
Do we need to speak up a bit? Do you know what? Okay. I think there's one dodgy microphone here, and let's...
Can you... Is this better? Can you hear me? Okay. So, travel demand arises from our need to move, to get from A to B, to do all the things we need to do. And the transport system meets that demand as best it can. If demand is greater than the supply, we get congestion, we get crowding, and that then prompts us to think about investing, and this is then the fundamental issue of transport economics, how much we invest to meet the growth of demand. So I want to look at the trends in travel over the past 45 years. The Department of Transport has been carrying out each year a national travel survey covering about 16,000 people in England who complete 7-day travel diaries, all the trips they make in the course of a week. And this is a very valuable source of information about how travel demand has changed over the years. There are 3 key parameters here. The bottom trend line is the trip rate, how many trips we make a year. And we're talking here about all the trips we make except international travel by air, which is a different story. Most of the travel we make is for daily purposes, our daily travel. And the bottom trend line shows that we've been making about 1,000 trips per person per year on average over this whole period. It's hardly changed. The middle trend line shows the amount of time we take, and that's changed rather little, about 360 hours per person per year, or very close to an hour a day on average over this whole period. This is an average across the population. Some people are more active than others. Some people never get out of the house. But the average is useful for thinking about how things are changing. This hour a day of travel is found pretty well wherever you look for settled human populations. And the reason is that there are only 24 hours a day and many activities we have to fit in, which constrains the amount of time we have for travel. But on the other hand, we need to get out and about to do the activities we need to undertake beyond the home, and that creates a demand for travel. And these two pressures balance out, generating the hour a day of travel, changing very little over 45 years. What has changed over that period is shown in the upper trend line, which is the distance travelled. So in the early 1970s, on average, we travelled about 4,500 miles per year. And that steadily grew until the turn of the century, when we just exceeded 7,000 miles per person per year. And then growth stopped. And indeed, the distance travel fell back a bit. So 2 clear phases, a growth phase and then a stationary phase. So why did the average distance travel grow? Well, obviously, if time was fixed, it was because we were going faster. And the main reason was because of the increasing ownership of cars. People invested in cars because they could travel faster, which gave them more choice of jobs, of homes, of services, all the things they needed to get to. If you live in a village that's poorly served by public transport and you don't have a car, your opportunities and choices are really quite limited. What access to modern forms of transport has done for the population as a whole is to generate the lifestyles we have today, which have quite extensive choice. But then growth has stopped, and actually we're now, this century, in a relatively stable phase where per person travel has stopped growing. There are a number of reasons for this cessation of growth. One, as was mentioned earlier, the less interest in the urban young people in car ownership and car use. And another reason, which I'll mention a bit later also, is that in fact now there are arguments that we have enough travel to meet our daily needs. So to sort of summarize the trends that I've just shown you, we saw strong growth in the last century to increase opportunities, choices, access to people and places. That we've seen no growth in personal travel in the present century, partly because there are sufficient opportunities and choices for those who have access to good means of travel. But some people, of course, are limited by the cost of car ownership in particular. Now, so far, I've talked about per person, per capita travel. But of course, we have population growth, as we know, particularly in Greater Cambridge. This increases travel demand, and a lot depends then on how the growing population is housed. If people are housed on new housing on greenfield sites, this will tend to lead to more car travel. On the other hand, if we can house people in urban areas at higher density, then that points to investment in public transport and the active modes of travel. Just to give an example of how we can have enough travel to meet our needs, A study a few years ago by the Competition Commission asked how much choice people have of the supermarkets, in this case the large supermarkets where you would typically take your car to do a weekly shop. They related where people live from census data to where the supermarkets were located and calibrated this relationship by time of travel. And the headline conclusion was that 80% of the urban population of Britain have a choice of three or more large supermarkets within 15 minutes drive, and 60% of us have a choice of 4 or more such supermarkets. Now you can ask yourself, if you have a choice of 3 or 4 supermarkets within 15 minutes drive, would you bother to drive further to have a choice of a 4th or a 5th? And if your answer is no, you wouldn't, because the choice of 3 or 4 is enough, that means you have enough travel, you have enough mobility to meet your demand for travel to supermarkets. What, as the economists would say, your demand for this purpose of travel is saturated. You don't need to travel further to have more choice. And there is data from similar studies for many other services to which we travel, schools, hospitals, employment, suggesting that if you have car-based mobility or good public transport, you have enough travel to meet your needs. And that would be an explanation for why the growth of travel on a per capita basis stopped growing this century. The one important exception to that rule is housing, because we can't build enough houses to meet our needs. And so people take advantage of any improvement in the transport system to travel further to get access to affordable housing. Now, this constraint on average travel time, this hour a day, is very relevant to how congestion operates. So congestion arises in locations with high population density and high car ownership, which means that the road system cannot accommodate all the trips that might be made, and people are therefore deterred by the expectation of delays, which would force them to be travelling longer than they can afford. So people make other choices. They may change the time of travel, where that's an option to avoid peak congestion. They may travel by a distant mode, where that's a possibility. They may go to a different destination, for example, shopping in one place rather than another, or they may avoid travel altogether, ordering their groceries online or working from home. What this means is that congestion is essentially self-limiting. If traffic builds up, the delays build up, and more people are deterred. So you don't get gridlock normally under normal conditions in a well-managed city. But for the same reason, it's very difficult to do much about congestion. You might think that by promoting public transport and cycling, getting people out of their cars, you would reduce congestion. But what happens is that you reduce delays initially, and that attracts back onto the system people who were previously deterred by the delays. And that's, I think, the experience of congestion charging in London. When it was introduced in 2003, there was a substantial reduction in delays, but over the next 5 years, they wore off. And part of the reason was, as we heard earlier, the reallocation of road space to pedestrians, bus lanes, and cyclists. But the other part of the reason was this release of previously suppressed trips. So congestion is really very hard to tackle. On the other hand, you can vary the volume and composition of traffic on the road network by varying the capacity for different kinds of vehicles. So in Greater Cambridge, there are Department of Transport investments in widening the A14 and in a future east-west expressway. These are intended to improve connectivity between cities, but they will permit more car-based commuting in and around Cambridge because the capacity of the road network will be increased. On the other hand, if you take away space for cars, for example, by converting a car lane to a bus lane or a bike lane, then you will reduce the amount of car traffic, and it operates through the congestion mechanism, that you take away space for cars, congestion builds up, and more people are deterred from using their cars. So you can vary the composition and volume of traffic on the road network, even if you can't make much impact on congestion. So, finally, what therefore can we do to improve matters? Well, we can invest in new infrastructure, but civil engineering works are very costly, so you don't get a lot for your money. Digital devices are much cheaper. One of the most useful things, which comes free of charge, are the route guidance apps like Google Maps or Waze, which give us optimal routes through congested road networks. They also tell us how long our trip will take, and that's really very useful because when you ask people why congestion is a problem, what bothers people most is the uncertainty about journey time. And the route guidance apps that predict your journey time reasonably accurately, in my experience, go some way to mitigating the impact of congestion. The other important digital innovation is the matching of supply and demand, for example, with the Uber ride-hailing cabs. Using that more generally may allow us to provide demand-responsive minibuses in rural areas rather than buses travelling along a fixed bus route, to allow these to respond to the demand that people have through apps. We can reallocate road space to make more room for fast, reliable buses. Speed and reliability of public transport is key to getting people out of their cars. Buses on congested roads are not attractive, but fast and reliable buses, as on the busway, are much more attractive. We can charge for parking as we do. We can charge for road use if we want to adopt that, as we have done in London. This is a useful way of raising revenue to fund better public transport. We can charge the more polluting vehicles. This is being done quite widely around the country. We can install electric charging points to promote electric vehicles. That's a good means of reducing carbon emissions and improving air quality. And the big question that we will have to wrestle with over the rest of our time together is, are we willing to find new sources of revenue from car users to support fast and reliable public transport? If we're willing to do that, we can get into a cycle of improvement. And if we think, on the other hand, that it's too difficult to raise more from the motorist, then our opportunities for improving the public transport system will really be quite limited. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David. You might want to just, well, I know you're going to hang around for a minute. At tables, if you want to just quickly jot down a couple of, given the time, I suggest, say, one key question for David. Again, same principle as before. If you have other key questions, that's fine. We can take those away. But maybe one key question, and then we can hear about that. And we might also just hear briefly in a minute from Peter about kind of the importance of the question that we're asking the Assembly. But first of all, if you can, at your tables, come up with one question for David, if you have one. Thank you. I'm just going to take this opportunity to just tell you quickly what's happening, a bit more about next weekend. So next weekend, so we've looked at impacts, we've looked at a vision. Next weekend, we're going to start to look at some of those measures, and we're going to start looking at them broadly in terms of the sort of, what are the measures where you can raise money and the sort of price mechanisms? What are some of the measures that you can use physically? What are the pros and cons of some of those? And then what are some of the measures that we've heard quite a lot about that are kind of other measures, incentives, behaviour shifts that enable us to move on. So that's going to be a lot of what we hear about, discuss in the second weekend. And start to think about some of those trade-offs, because some of them, I think some of the earlier speakers talked about, carrots and sticks. Some of them talked about, a pill and then what sweetens that. So what's the right balance? And I'll bring Peter in a minute just to clarify that these are still up for grabs. But first of all, let's go to David and his questions. Table 4, have you got a question for David?
Oh, sorry.
Yes, you. That's you, Mel. Table 4. You've been there all weekend.
Is that on? Our question is, reducing cars, you know, car parking spaces, etc., is going to reduce revenue. Therefore, how do we tackle the financial knock-on effect of that?
Yeah, there are trade-offs. If you cut back on public parking operated by a local authority, you will lose revenue. If, on the other hand, you were to introduce congestion charging, you would create a source of revenue for that authority. Another form of parking revenue, which has been used in Nottingham, is called a workplace parking levy, whereby workplace parking has an annual charge on it. That partly reduces car commuting and partly is a source of revenue, which in Nottingham they used to fund an extension of their tram system. So local authorities do have sources of raising revenue from motorists, including varying charges upwards. But if you take away parking space, you lose that element of it, certainly.
And we're going to hear a couple of those, a couple of those measures that David just referred to. We're going to hear more about in the second weekend. Table 7, have you got a question?
Some of it has been covered, and I know we're going to be looking at it weekend too, but what are the main ways of raising funding from car users in terms of headings?
Yeah, so, I mean, the main way, of course, is the national tax on petrol and diesel, which goes direct to the Treasury. In the long run, that will probably have to change because of electric vehicles. So electric vehicles are more expensive to buy at the moment, but are cheaper to run because you're running them on electricity, which simply just has a 5% VAT on it. But I think as electric vehicles become more common, there'll be an argument that electric vehicle owners ought to pay something towards the upkeep of the road system, and therefore we may need road user charging for that purpose, and that could be divided between the Treasury and local authorities. So in the long run, I think probably that's the way we're going to go. In the short run, parking and a local congestion charge are options.
So it's sort of congestion charge mechanisms. So sort of within a Greater Cambridge is sort of congestion charge.
If you charge cars according to how they're used, you can both hope to influence the level of congestion, but also to raise revenue.
Yeah.
For the reason I argued earlier, it's quite hard to reduce congestion, but you can use this approach to raise revenue.
Thank you. Table, I can't remember what table number you are. Penny. Yep. Ooh, okay.
It's all right, we're old
I took
friends.
that one, yeah.
So, David, our table mainly had a conversation with each other about what did David really mean? What did he really say? And we talked about things like the difference between the flow of cars and the flow of humans in terms of congestion. But the question that we came up with was, so is congestion a fact of life?
Yes, I mean, I think where you've got cars and other four-wheel vehicles on roads, congestion, in densely populated areas with high levels of car ownership, congestion is a fact of life. In rural areas, which are much less densely populated, cars can flow quite freely. I mean, cars are a very attractive way of getting around where there's room to use them on the roads and room to park at both ends of the journey. That's why they've become so popular. But it's that very popularity in urban areas that has limited their use. So that's vehicles on roads, but which will be subject to congestion. But the decision is how much space do you allocate to such vehicles. If you take away road space, you have less traffic, you have fewer people exposed to congestion. And attempting to segregate public transport from general traffic on the roads, in my view, is the sensible way forward, because you can then provide fast and reliable public transport, whether it's buses or trains, which become an attractive alternative to cars on congested roads.
Thank you, David. Table 6. If you've heard any questions answered, then we will skip on.
We have a question. What is the main reason for people to travel in and around Cambridge? So is it supermarket, school or work or anything else?
Do you want Peter to answer that, or...? I mean, I don't know whether you know that, but I'm sure Peter knows more about. What's the main travel?
The main reason.
The main reason for travel, or congestion?
The main reason for travel.
So I showed you the results of the National Travel Survey earlier. That travel survey, which asks a sample population of why they travel, breaks down the figures by journey purpose. From memory, shopping is the most common form of travel. Commuting is important, though less than you might think. Escorting children to school is quite important, and visiting family and friends and general leisure purposes. All these are quite significant, and they don't change much over time. There's some drift downwards of shopping trips as people buy more stuff online. There's some small drift downwards in commuting as people tend to break away from the 5-day journey to work, working out of office or sometime from home. But if you're interested in this data is readily available from the Department of Transport website for the National Travel Survey.
Peter, does that reflect Greater Cambridge?
All I'd say slightly differently is, to slightly twist the question, is if you're looking at congestion and not travel, because if congestion's your problem, in the Greater Cambridge context, it's commuting that is the greater cause of the congestion, because it's the peak times when most people are travelling. So that's what causes the problem that people are experiencing.
Thank you. Kevin's table, where did...
So is it really viable to eradicate congestion, or do we focus on just making it cleaner?
No, I've argued you can't eradicate congestion. You can reduce the amount of it by reducing road space. So this is the key argument I make. Congestion is very hard to impact on, but the amount of road space you allocate to cars and other vehicles, you can vary. And if you increase it, you'll get more traffic, and if you'll decrease it, you'll get less traffic.
Thank you. To Steve's table? Behind you? It's behind you.
It sounds like a...
Yeah.
So, well, we touched on this, and it may be zeroing in on Peter again, because is the big question: congestion charge or no congestion charge?
Well, it is the big question, because it is a potentially important source of revenue, but it would be a big step to take. And in thinking of the measures that we might contemplate the next weekend, some things you can do incrementally. You can vary parking incrementally. You can add to cycling capacity incrementally. But other decisions are big single decisions, and introducing a congestion charge will be a big single decision, which can therefore be quite difficult to take.
I'm going to bring in Peter, I think, at this point, because I think it might be that seems to be a nice segue into...
Well, thank you. So, I mean, this is not about the question of congestion charge or not congestion charge, right? That's one of the considerations. But actually, this slide, I think, hopefully tries to convey where we are. We've got some money for infrastructure, and we've got some outline plans, and we'll continue to consult, and I'll get my resident and business complaints about removing parking, which is entirely legitimate, and we'll deal with all of those things. But we don't have the money to build a metro, because it's hugely expensive. Yep. So to meet the challenge that we've been set, we need to do more than just build some stuff. So what other options and what decisions, if it were you, or what advice would you give to the politicians about that? So it might be we say we need to grasp digital and we need to exploit that as much as we can. We need to, actually, we're less interested in charging. This is about how we use the road space we've got. We're simply going to put super cycle lanes in. That's going to be the priority, and the traffic can sit on the A14 or the M11. And that may be actually, we might be interested in charging if we think it will deliver better public transport, or it will deliver a new tunnel under Cambridge for a metro. But then which charging might we be interested in? Because actually we're particularly interested in air quality, and so therefore, following where London's got to on the ultra-low emission zone, charging for emissions is important to us. Or, London previously on road charging for roads are important to us, but only on the basis that we get something for it. So that might be important. And then the whole question around electric charging and how we progress that. So this isn't a narrowly defined ploy for congestion charging or not congestion charging. It's, if we can't do everything we've got on infrastructure, the other options, where should the politicians go with these other options? And all or none. I mean, that's the balance that we've got to draw, and that's the balance that they've got to consider when they consider this in December. And what you come up with in terms of recommendations is going to be put in front of them.
Thank you, Peter. That, I think, was a really useful intervention there. Clive, have you got a question for David?
So it's just carrying on this conversation about revenue raising. So should the motorist, the car user, be bearing the brunt of the cost here? So should the charge be on the motorist, or should there be a more equitable distribution of the revenue?
Well, that's a really key question. I mentioned the workplace parking levy as adopted in Nottingham, which is a charge on employers, which they may or may not pass on to people who park in those spaces. But for the rest, it is borne by motorists. And that's because of the dominance of car use in Greater Cambridge. The argument would be that a modest charge per motorist could generate useful amounts of revenue that could allow the bus system to be improved, which you would hope would create a virtuous circle so that some of those motorists will switch to buses and therefore bear less charge themselves. But there's not really another major source of revenue. The council tax is under huge stress from all sorts of sources. Central government handouts, well, the 500 million allocated to Greater Cambridge for the city deal, is exceptionally generous. And if you want to build the metro, you're going to need even more. So you are going to have to think about internal resources, and I think it's going to be from existing car users.
Okay, thank you. So final table, Liz's table.
So our main question was that one as well that's just been taken. So another one is, we heard a little bit about it this morning, but any other examples of how congestion charges have been received in other cities, or charges in general?
Well, there have been 3 major cities in the world which have adopted congestion charging. London, we know about. And interestingly, it's very acceptable in London. There's no pushback against it. It's been in operation since 2003. Technically, it works fine. It generates useful amounts of revenue. The impact on congestion is quite limited, but it works. Stockholm, as we heard this morning, did a very interesting experiment of introducing it and then turning it off for 6 months, having a referendum, and people said, yeah, we can live with this. The other place is Singapore, where it works well. So you might think, on the basis of 3 major cities where it works, other places would adopt it. And many places have contemplated it and backed off, in particular Manchester and Edinburgh, where they had referenda and people got scared. New York is seriously looking at this because they need a source of revenue to renovate the subway, which is in a pretty bad state. And it's quite likely they will adopt it, not so much to regulate congestion, but as a source of revenue which they can raise internally. So it would be feasible for Cambridge as a small city to pioneer this for small cities. Technically, it can be made to work. The question is it publicly acceptable to the population as a whole? Is it politically acceptable to the elected members? That's the real question.
Great. Thank you, David. I think we'll give you a little ripple.